Chapter 243. Dear, let me show you a trick. The disabled young man sitting in the wheelchair was neat and tidy. Although he was only wearing coarse linen clothes, he still showed an extraordinary temperament. At this moment, facing the ugly woman whose half-face was ruined, he smiled gently and brightly, and even hid the unerasable gray between his eyebrows for a moment. The ugly woman stopped her work and turned her head to look. She saw that the young man turned over one hand, and a mask appeared in his palm out of thin air. It was as white as bone and as jade. The delicate patterns flashed a warm light under the dim oil lamp. Husband, the woman was surprised, and then she became flustered. She quickly got up and pressed down the disabled young man's hands. She whispered, Husband, did you steal it from somewhere? The mask was so delicate that it must be expensive. It was difficult for their family to eat, let alone buy such an item. The disabled young man laughed, and a touch of sadness flashed in his eyes. Don't worry. The owner of this thing has always been your husband. I will teach you how to use it. This thing can isolate the psychic awareness and has many uses. But for you, as long as it can temporarily cover the injury on your face, it is enough. When our child is born, I will make a plaster to cure your face. The young man slightly pursed his lips. When he thought that his wife was pregnant, but still had to walk on the street with a humiliated face to support the family, he couldn't help but clench his fists. In the next moment, his clenched hands were gently held by his wife. A moving smile appeared on her ugly face. She said, Husband, I don't care. It's my honor to have you as my companion in this life. Under the dim oil lamp, the disabled young man stared at his wife's rough and ugly face. His clenched hands gradually loosened, and his eyes gradually became blurred. A man would not easily shed tears until he was sad. His sins could not be washed away in the next life. Why did I meet you at this moment, Lee? Suli. Suli. The shout came from far away, and her shoulders were shaken. Suli suddenly came to her senses. Her eyes gradually focused, and a pair of slightly anxious faces came into her eyes, which was only a finger's distance from her. Her slightly red eyes shrank, and her breath was slightly stagnant. She subconsciously stepped back a few steps and knocked over the tea table behind her. Crash! The teacup shattered on the floor. Seeing that Suli was scared, Lingley found that he was too close to her. He couldn't help but be a little stiff. Now he was less important in Suli's heart. Don't be afraid. I didn't do it on purpose. Lingley tried to comfort her, but he was also confused. In his impression, Suli should not be so timid. Miss, what happened to you? Mammy Leek hurriedly went upstairs and was shocked when she saw Lingley, who had changed his clothes. Didn't he leave? Why was he still here? Originally, her impression of the third master of the Ling family was that he was a scourge and the type that Miss could never get in touch with. But when she saw Ling Li's face that day, the more she looked at him, the more familiar she felt. Then she suddenly remembered that he was the young man that Miss had saved and treated in the yard in the valley. The same face, different temperament, but definitely the same person. The Ling family's third young master had a hidden identity just like Miss. Mammy Leaf suddenly realized and was secretly happy. It seemed that Master Lingley and Miss were a good match. Unfortunately, only she knew a little about their identities. It doesn't matter. I just knocked over the teacup. Clean it up later. Suli saw Wu Bin, who was going to come downstairs. She quickly stopped Wu Bin's figure. Perhaps even Suli herself didn't realize what such a natural action meant. She clearly knew that as long as Wu Bin came in, Lingley would definitely have to leave. In this way, she could communicate with Lingley less and expose herself. But she stopped Wu Bin. She subconsciously didn't want Lingley to leave. Yes, Mississippi. Mammy Lee glanced at Lingley and left with a smile. Sue Lee took a breath slightly. She walked forward a few steps and walked to Lingley. She gently took the mask that he still kept in the posture of handing over. Aren't you afraid that your identity will be exposed by giving me such a mask? Lingley couldn't help laughing. He shook his head and said, I don't need to expose myself in front of you. This thing is the secret treasure of the Emo cult, just like my mask. With it, even mortals can be isolated from the detection of seniors of the longevity realm. It also has the effect of disguise. I will teach you a pithy formula, and you can master it. Then Lingley pointed between Sue Lee's eyebrows and passed the pithy formula to her. But he felt pity. It was a pity that his cultivation was not enough to suppress the old people of the Emo cult. With the unique mental method of the hierarch of the Emo cult, the mask could be refined into the body and carried with him. It was the best magic treasure to save his life. In the Desu town, he relied on the mask to disguise himself and escaped all the way. Otherwise, it was impossible for him to escape with his original appearance when a killer of a branch chased him. Sue Lee lowered her eyebrows and reached out to touch the pattern on the mask. Then she returned it to him and said, This thing is precious. I can't take it. Lingley frowned slightly, but he soon stretched out his eyebrows. He put the mask on the tea table that he helped up and smiled carelessly. It's just an ordinary secret treasure. There are many of them in the Emo cult. You have helped me so much. Don't you want to accept a small gift from me? Sue Lee pursed her lips slightly. If there were many secret treasures, why did he hide this thing in his body when he had nothing in the previous life? Well, as you wish, I accept it. The night wind blew and the clothes of the two people on the roof fluttered. Master, that is the Yen-faced jade bone. It is a pair with your mask. The elders want to keep it for the future Madam Hierarch. You, just give it away. Ling Imo thought of Sue Lee's reluctant expression and suddenly felt depressed. Lingley smiled and said helplessly, Didn't you see that she was unwilling to accept it? If she can, it's best if she is willing to be the Madam Hierarch. If not, I will always wait for her. When I break through to immortal level, do you think those old things who are about to be buried can still control my thoughts? Of course not. Ling Imo lowered his head and firmly said, You are the leader of the Emo cult. Lingley narrowed his eyes and didn't dwell on this topic. He looked at the busy night market and was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, How is the investigation of the Wanjian sect going? The news from the elders' pavilion said that the Wanjian sect was in chaos and the young head ran away. Those people who came to Yunjing were already looking for the young head. Lingley sneered and said, Have you ever seen the subordinates who are looking for the young head with murderous intent? Ling Imo was shocked and said, Master, you mean, it's better for the Wanjian sect to be busy with its own affairs. The Emo cult also needs to continue to cultivate and strengthen. However, the Dongfang family should have a connection with the Wanjian sect. Lingley looked serious. It was more dangerous than he thought to find the murderer for his father. In the affiliated school of the National Academy. After Lingley left, Sue Lee came to the underground addendum with the mask. She glanced at the poisonous mother-child insect which was still slowly wriggling in the bottle. Then she looked back at the mask. After many twists and turns, the mask returned to her hand. Taking a deep breath, Sue Lee's lips squirmed and she murmured. The jade bone mask immediately glowed and became brighter and brighter. Finally, it melted into a ball of jade-colored water and flowed into Sue Lee's body through the pores of her palm. A slightly hot flow passed through her tendons and meridians. Sue Lee closed her eyes and looked inside her pubic region. As expected, she saw the pocket-sized version of the mask lying quietly in the center of the pubic region. She naturally knew how to refine it into her body. Although she didn't practice the mental method of the emo cult in her previous life, Lingley forced her to recite those obscure articles hundreds and thousands of times. Those words had already become an inseparable part of her soul. At that time, although she didn't understand Lingley's intention, she obediently took a lot of time to review and recite every day. Until she encountered a disaster later and got the Ghost Valley meditation direction in the brothel of the military, she realized that Lingley had predicted the future. She regarded those secret methods as the seeds of revenge. The crazy price was not killing the enemy with his own hands, but killing Dongfang Rui by mistake and regretting to death. Tick, Suli slightly bowed her head. It turned out that her nails pinched into her palm unconsciously. Drops of red blood dripped down along the lines of her palm. In silence, she slowly got up and walked to the table. She picked up the glass bottle containing the poisonous child mother insect. The blood flowed into the bottle. The poisonous child mother insect was immediately stimulated. Its surface seemed to be corroded and there was a burst of light smoke. Suli, you are just a malicious ghost coming for revenge. Even if you accept the mask, you can only take it to hell. You can't waver anymore. At the same time when Suli's blood flowed into the glass bottle, far away in the frontier. Zhu Yan, with bruises all over her body and numb expression, climbed up the city wall with difficulty with stones that were much heavier than her. Her eyes were dark, just like Suli who had lost hope in the previous life. After leaving Yunjing City, she wanted to reveal Suli's true face to the public. Even if she knew that no one believed what she said, it would be good if she could talk about it. However, Suli, the devil, didn't even give her such a poor chance. She was mute. On the first day when she became mute, Zhu Yan howled miserably, but she was repeatedly beaten by the officers and soldiers. After being tormented a few times, she learned her lesson and stopped making a fuss. However, her body started to ache faintly from time to time. Moreover, along with the passage of time, the pain became more and more unbearable, and it tortured her to the point that she couldn't sleep at night. Retribution. Dragging the stone to the city wall, Zhu Yan laughed silently and burst into tears. This was not the retribution from heaven. It was the retribution from Arya, the girl who was tortured by her since childhood. Arya's retribution was more ferocious than any scourge or beast. Suddenly, a burning pain began from her back and slowly spread. Aw, 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 aw. A blood-curdling scream came from her mouth, and the stone in her hand fell to the ground. It fell directly onto the city wall and almost hit the overseer. The supervisor was so scared that his face turned pale. When he looked up and saw Zhu Yan on the city wall, he couldn't help but scold and went upstairs while waving his whip. Crazy woman, you are courting death. Aw, 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 aw. Zhu Yan scratched her whole body in horror, and soon her skin was scratched. The blood flowed along the skin, which was hideous and terrible. The supervisor was shocked and took a few steps back. This woman in front of him couldn't have really gone crazy, right? Help me. Something is burning me. Help me. Aw, 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 aw. Zhu Yan kept screaming, but she became mute. No one could understand what she meant. More and more people gathered around to watch the fun. Several supervisors also came over. They all looked at Zhu Yan and pointed at her in a circle. Is she bewitched? I think it's quite like. As soon as the words came out, everyone unconsciously shrank their necks, as if there was a cold wind blowing past their ears. Don't talk nonsense, or you will lose your head. Aw, 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 aw. Aw, 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 aw. In such a miserable scream and the indifferent discussion of the onlookers, Zhu Yan scratched herself to death, and the blood flowed on the ground. Seeing that she finally died, the onlookers suddenly dispersed, as if nothing had happened. Chapter 244. In the underground adytum of the affiliated school of the National Academy. The poisonous mother-child insect in the glass bottle was already soaked in the pool of blood and motionless. She had finally taken the first step. Su Li stared at it in a daze. It was so easy to end Zhu Yan's life in this life, which made her feel extremely unreal. Maybe when she let Su Zipei go to hell, she wouldn't feel much better. She knew there was no answer, but she still couldn't help thinking about it and couldn't help being confused. When she finished all the revenge and helped Lingli to accomplish the important things, where was her way back? After a few days, it was the eve of the new year. It was snowing lightly. Every family was decorated with lanterns and colored banners. They were busy with a table of reunion dinner. They were full of joy when they saw the sky full of white. Auspicious snow indicated a bumper harvest. The next year would be much better. This day was also the day of ancestor worship. Dongfang Rui changed his solemn clothes early in the morning and entered the palace to participate in the sacrificial ceremony of the Dongfang family. Su Li went to the yard and the osmanthus forest with Wu Bin. After rebuking everyone, Su Li knelt in front of the tombstone alone. She added the yellow paper in her hand to the fire. The sky was full of flying ashes and white snow. Mom, I don't know that I have come back for the third year. Su Li smiled lightly, and there was warmth in her eyes. It seemed that it was not a tombstone in front of her, but a living person. Compared with the previous life, I am much better in this life. I can come to your tomb to talk to you and I didn't hurt my father. The only thing that bothers me is Lingli. I never thought that one day, he would take the initiative to pursue me. I never thought that after I refused him again and again, he just smiled and continued to work hard. He never said that he would give up. I don't want to see his increasingly disappointed face anymore. Mom, what should I do? If you know it in the afterlife, give me a hint. Su Li took a deep breath and took out a copper coin from the purse. She held it in her hand and whispered, if the literal is the best, then you want me to let go of everything and let nature take its course. If the literal is the worst, then let me continue to be stubborn. Ding! The copper coin flew into the air. Su Li looked up and saw nothing but the wind with fine snow. The copper coin was also blown down and fell off the cliff. Su Li squinted her eyes and stamped on the ground. She turned into a fallen leaf and fell into the cliff. In the osmanthus forest full of withered branches, everything was barren. Su Li walked quietly in the forest and stepped on the dead branches and rotten leaves, which creaked to show her sincerity. She didn't use her psychic awareness to lock the copper coins, but only looked for them with her eyes. However, with her innate realm's keen eyesight, even if she didn't use her psychic sense, she could still quickly find the copper coins that fell on the thick branches. That was, Su Li flew to pick up the copper coins and opened her palm. Big letter. Tong. Treasure. Literally upwards. Su Li's nervous face suddenly relaxed, as if she had won a battle with a strong enemy. She took a long sigh of relief and stopped struggling between right and wrong. Thank you, Mother. In the ancestral temple of the Ling family, Ms. Gu stood in front of the memorial tablet with burning incense in her hand. Behind her, Chiu Meng, Ling Ping, Ling Li and Ling Qinglan were all in the room. They went forward to kneel down in turn. Even Ling Li knelt down from the wheelchair with the help of Ling Qinglan. He knelt down 3 times and kowtowed 9 times. After the ceremony, Ms. Gu inserted the burning incense into the incense burner and sighed with loneliness. She said, Meng, go with them and leave me alone. Yes, Mother. Chiu Meng put away the faint sadness in her eyes and left the ancestral temple with everyone. Every year on the eve of the Lunar New Year, it was not a happy event for the Ling family. There was only sadness for the relatives. Ms. Goop personally saw off her husband, son and grandson. No one knew how she felt. It stopped snowing, and the yard was covered with white snow. The snow fell on the branches like blooming white flowers, which was really beautiful. Ling Ping pushed Ling Li's wheelchair and walked in the yard. His experienced eyes were full of pain and longing. He tried to speak in a calm tone, "Brotherly, do you remember the eldest brother?" Ling Li was slightly stunned, and a handsome and generous young man flashed in front of him. He immediately nodded gently and grinned, "Of course I remember. Second brother, although I was young at that time, I had a good memory. At that year, the eldest brother was 17 and the second brother was 12. He was only 8 years old. The age of the eldest brother was fixed forever. At that year, he met the old guy of the Yinma cult and took over the Yinma cult. From then on, he protected the second brother from being harmed by villains. It has been 8 years. Time flies so fast." Ling Ping grabbed the snow on the roadside and made it into a ball. He was smiling, but his voice was dry. He said, "When we were young, the eldest brother was the most naughty. Every year, he secretly took us here to have a snowball fight. If we were found out by our father, we would be punished with bamboo shoots. But the eldest brother didn't change his ways. We followed him every time and enjoyed it." Ling Li was silent. He came with the memory. Every time he was taken to have a snowball fight by the eldest brother, he was disdainful. But he didn't expect that the memory at that time became a beautiful memory that could only be remembered now. Brotherly, the second brother, is incompetent. Ling Ping suddenly knelt down and sobbed. Everyone in the Ling family knew that there was something wrong, but no one dared to investigate further. He wanted to trace the clues several times and encountered several crises of life and death. Every time, the force that secretly protected him saved him and warned him that he was not powerful enough and should not act rashly. He was still too weak. Second brother, Ling Li's expression was complicated. He stretched out his hands and gently hugged the general who was crying like a child. He said in a gentle tone, "Second brother, compared with me, you are very powerful. You support the Ling family alone. Without you, the Ling family has long been gone." It was snowing again, and the scene was quiet. Chiao Meng, who hid outside the courtyard, covered her face. Her nose was sour, but she didn't cry. She was the hostess of the Ling family. She should be stronger than anyone else. At the round table, there was laughter. It seemed that the sadness was gone. After dinner, Ling Qinglan said that he would stay for a night. After going back to the courtyard and walking around, he left the Ling house with a basket of paper money. "Master, do you want to follow him?" Ling Mo immediately came to report. Ling Lik shook his head slightly and drank a mouthful of Liahua spirits. He looked slightly tipsy and said, "No, I know who he is going to see." It was dark at night. At this moment, every family had fallen asleep, but there was still a light on the desolate grave. In front of a tombstone made of marble, there was a table of sumptuous dishes and wine. At this moment, the wine and dishes were cold, but the people didn't leave. Chen Gong leaned against the tombstone and stroked the surface, just like stroking the cheek of his lover. He spent every year's reunion night like this. "June, soon. Wait for me for a moment, and I will come to you right away." Ling Qinglan heard the low male voice. Ling Qinglan shook his head slightly and walked to the tombstone. He added a handful of paper money to the dying fire. Chapter 245. Chen Gong looked up at Ling Qinglan and was not surprised. As early as before, Ling Qinglan had contacted him with his real identity. After a few months, Chen Gong was no longer shocked. After that, although they contacted each other secretly, they had no chance to communicate face to face because of their positions. You come at the right time. I have a bottle of wine left. Drink with me. Chen Gong looked at Ling Qinglan. Under the flickering firelight, he showed a very shallow smile. Ling Qinglan put down a stack of paper money and showed the wine jar in his left hand. He smiled and said, "The first-class Liehua spirits of the Linli building. Have a taste." Chen Gong was surprised and said, "A jar of first-class Liehua spirits of 100,000 taels." Ling Qinglan nodded slightly and sat next to Chen Gong. He opened the clay seal with one palm, and the strong fragrance of wine spread. In fact, the price of first-class Liehua spirits was more than 100,000 taels. Businessmen who couldn't buy the original Liehua spirits bought first-class Liehua spirits. The transaction price of each jar was nearly 1 million taels. If Mr. Li didn't give face to the Yinmo cult, he couldn't get the wine at the original price. Chen Gong drank a cup of wine suspiciously. He felt that the spicy wine passed through his intestines like a raging fire. It was really refreshing. Good wine. Chen Gong exclaimed and then said in a low voice, "The Liehua spirits of the Linli building really deserve their reputation. But, the financial situation of the Ling family has always been very tight. Even if you want to express something to me, you shouldn't let Madame Meng bear it." Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed and his tone was still relaxed. "Lord Qin, you don't need to test me. I can tell you directly that there is another force behind me. It's very easy for me to take out 100,000 taels. If you are willing to tell me the details of the extermination of the Yi family, you will definitely gain a lot. Sure enough, you work for the third prince." Chen Gong's eyes were vigilant and complicated. "The Ling family secretly adopted you and concealed your identity. But it is a fact that the Ling family has declined these years. Without the help of the third prince, how can you be in charge of the supreme judiciary at such a young age?" "No, Lord Qin, you are wrong." Ling Qinglan smiled slightly. Chen Gong was slightly stunned and asked, "Am I wrong?" "Indeed, even the third prince thinks that it is because of him that I can get to where I am today. But the fact is often more complicated than the imagination." "Lord Qin." Chen Gong frowned slightly and couldn't help asking, "Who is the person behind you?" "Lord Qin, you don't need to know the person behind me. You only need to know that he has nothing to do with the royal family of the Dehan country. It is a wise choice to cooperate with me to investigate the real murderer." Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed with hatred. He said in a low voice, "Lord Qin, don't you want to avenge your wife?" Chen Gong was silent for a long time. Looking at Ling Qinglan's eyes which were so similar to his, he finally nodded and said, "Emo, I believe you once. I hope you won't let me down." Ling Qinglan nodded gently and breathed a sigh of relief. Chen Gong had kept the secret for many years and didn't believe anyone. This time, Chen Gong finally opened his heart and let him speak. 14 years ago, I was just an ordinary doctor in the Ministry of Justice." Chen Gong said and glanced at Ling Qinglan who was calm. He said, "The Yi family opened the secret door overnight, which shocked the whole city. The Ministry of Penalty was ordered to collect the corpses for investigation. I also went there at that time." Ling Qinglan clenched his hands unconsciously and a vague picture flashed through his mind. At the time of the tragedy, he only remembered his mother's mournful scream, as well as a blurry black shadow striking his left chest. After that, all that was left in his consciousness was an endless chill. He stared at Chen Gong's face and asked in a low voice, "Did you find anything at that time?" "Everyone was killed by one blow, even General Yi." It seemed that Chen Gong recalled the tragedy at that time. There was deep doubt and horror in his eyes. He said, "General Yi was the most powerful deputy of General Ling at that time. His cultivation reached the inborn 8th hurdle. Who on earth could kill him with one blow?" He didn't have time to protect anyone to escape. The longevity realm. Ling Qinglong narrowed his eyes slightly and thought of the mysterious man beside Mr. Li a few days ago. If it was a senior in such a realm, it was absolutely possible for him to destroy the Yi family overnight. Although I was shocked at that time, I still kept my reason. After some investigation, I found a lot of doubts. Later, Qingjun had an accident, so I didn't have the mood to care about anything. Chen Gong sighed with a dignified look. He turned his head and looked directly at Ling Qinglong. He said, I haven't told anyone what I'm going to say next for 14 years. You should listen carefully. Ling Qinglong was slightly shocked and subconsciously lowered his voice. I'd like to hear the details. First of all, after the murderer destroyed the Yi family, he should be ready to burn the corpses to destroy the evidence. The wall was full of firewood and kerosene. But I don't know why he was delayed and left directly. So, I could see the first scene of the crime. Ling Qinglong was slightly afraid. If the murderer really set the fire, he couldn't survive. Then Chen Gong laughed at himself and said, later, the fire couldn't be avoided. It burned in the Ministry of Penalty. If I didn't sneak out because of my wife, I was afraid that I would have died in the fire. Second, the identity of the murderer. Chen Gong gently touched the tombstone and said, at that time, I stole my wife's body back home. The expression on my wife's face was not fear, but confusion. Over the years, I have been thinking that maybe the real identity of the murderer was someone my wife knew. My wife must have seen what happened in the Yi family at that time, so she was killed. But I secretly investigated all the people who knew my wife over the years, but no one matched. If a senior of the longevity realm really wanted to hide his real cultivation, how could Lord Chen see through him? Ling Qinglong shook his head and said. When it came to the understanding of the martial arts circle and the spiritual circle, he was several times more thorough than Chen Gong. Maybe you're right. Chen Gong said with a wry smile, but even if it is true, I can't go deeper to investigate anything. So, my attention was soon transferred to the third doubt, the Minister of the Ministry of Penalty, Prime Minister Tang. Prime Minister Tang was the Minister of the Ministry of Penalty. Ling Qinglong's pupils shrank slightly, and he thought of a lot in an instant. Yes. Chen Gong said coldly, at that time, a lot of news was regarded as a scandal by the royal family and was tightly blocked. The Ministry of Penalty was burned down. Prime Minister Tang was summoned to the palace, but he was not severely punished. Zui Qian was suddenly transferred to Yunjing a few years later. He was promoted all the way and became the most important person in the Han dynasty. So, I always have a guess in my heart. Who was the officer of the Supreme Judiciary who was responsible for handling the case at that time? Is it? Ling Qinglong's eyes flashed with a dangerous light, and his heartbeat accelerated slightly. Chen Gong sighed with surprise and said, you guessed right. It was Ma De of the Ma family. Now they are the right-hand men of the emperor, and they have great power in the court. I should have thought of it. In the whole Yunjing city, except for them, who else can do that? Ling Qinglong's face was extremely gloomy. He stood up and was about to leave. What do you want to do? Chen Gong looked gloomy and stopped him. This matter is based on speculation. We can't get any evidence. If you impulsively die, won't you hurt the Ling family? Ling Qinglong trembled slightly. The blood in his eyes faded away, and he became sober. He took several deep breaths and slowly sat down again. He said in a flat tone, you want evidence. It's simple. The senior of the longevity realm has a long life. He must be alive now. We can catch the senior of the longevity realm who practices the cold skill and torture him. Then we can know the truth. Chen Gong sneered and couldn't help but satirize, how can you catch the senior of the longevity realm? He can kill you with one palm. I have my own way. Ling Qinglan took a deep breath, and a huge plan appeared in his mind. He said, Lord Qin, you just need to wait and see how I find out the murderer. Chen Gong looked at Ling Qinglan's slightly gloomy face in surprise and doubt. Why did he have the confidence to fight against such a giant? However, Ling Qinglan's appearance really made Chen Gong feel a little hopeful. If you really have that ability, then I will wait and see. After the third day of the first lunar month, Su Li moved out of the Lord Roy's mansion and returned to the affiliated school of the National Academy in Dongfang Roy's reluctant gaze. Miss, don't you open all these gifts? Mammy Li held the gift boxes in her arms helplessly and couldn't help but ask. At the beginning of the new year, both young talents and playboys in Yunjing City sent a lot of gifts to Su Li. Just by looking at the packaging, Su Li knew that the gifts were very expensive. The reason they used was surprisingly the same, to thank Su Li for her wonderful lessons. As for their purpose, Su Li didn't know. Keep the gifts of the Ling Mansion and send the rest to the warehouse. The indifferent voice sounded. Mammy Li raised her head in surprise and saw that Su Li was lowering her head and carefully looking at the blue jade hairpin in her hand. Her eyes were clear and bright. That was old Mrs.'s favorite blue water cloud hairpin. Did the Lord give it to Miss? Mammy Li's eyes were wet. She quickly wiped her tears with her sleeves and went back to find the gifts of the Ling Mansion that she put aside separately. She gently put it on the corner of the table and quietly left. This is the token of love that I gave to your mother. She fled to the Qinghe province and pawned it. She probably exchanged it for enough food to raise you. I searched all the pawn shops in the Qinghe province and finally found it. Now I give it to you. Su Li seemed to hear what Dongfang Rui said that night. She slightly narrowed her eyes and smiled. Then she turned around and inserted the hairpin into her black hair in front of the mirror. There was a touch of blue in the thick ink, which was incomparably beautiful. After that, Su Li picked up the gift box on the table and pulled off the ribbon. What was inside was revealed. It was just a piece of calligraphy written on good paper and ink. She could smell the faint fragrance of ink. 16 big characters were written in bold and vigorous calligraphy. They were self-contained. Chapter 246. Honey, do you know that when it comes to poetry, the level of my hometown is much lower than that of the Han dynasty? I will read it to you. There was a burst of laughter and helpless dissuasion in the room. Honey, you are drunk. Have a rest, your husband is known as a good drinker. How much wine is it? Listen to me. The so-called beauty is on the other side of the water. A fair lady is a gentleman's lover. Honey, do you think it's nice? It's nice. Honey, you are really drunk. My wife, your husband is really not drunk. Your husband will prove it to you right now. Miss, why is your face red? Mammy Li's voice came into her ears. Su Li suddenly came to herself and touched her hot face. She pretended to be calm and went back to the room. But she quickened her pace. I'm going out. Don't let anyone know. I know. Mammy Li laughed in her heart and quickly responded. She saw Su Li go into the boudoir and pick up a scroll on the table stealthily. She followed Su Yun in her early years so she could read. Her literary attainments were enough for her to be a teacher in a remote place. At this moment, when she saw the 16 words on the scroll, she couldn't help but be amazed. What a profound calligraphy attainment. What a beautiful sentence. Mammy Li knew it was extraordinary at a glance. She couldn't put it down immediately. Such a calligraphy treasure must be kept well. It turned out that the third master of the Ling family not only pretended to be disabled, but also pretended to be a playboy. He really hid his talent. While Mammy Lee was surprised, Su Li had changed into a simple dress and was about to leave. Mammy Lee hurriedly shouted, "Miss, can I help you to frame this calligraphy?" Su Li stopped slightly. She didn't turn around, but her voice came from afar. "Whatever." Mammy Lee couldn't help but chuckle. The miss was really the same as the old Mississippi. She obviously liked that man very much, but she stubbornly refused to admit it. Every time Mammy Lee saw Su Li speak sarcastically to the third master of the Ling family, she was worried for the Mississippi. It was all thanks to the young master of the Ling family that he had a heart that was stronger than most people. No matter how young Miss rejected him, he was still like a dog's skin plaster, stubbornly pestering her. Looking at the young Miss's expression, it was obvious that she had been moved. Mammy Lee was very happy when she thought about it. She looked up and down at the calligraphy and painting in her hand. She put it down carefully and turned around to prepare the materials for mounting the calligraphy. "Steward Wu, young Miss said that she wants to rest for a while. Don't disturb her." At the same time, by the riverside of the former site of the Hongyan house, Ling Li stood by the river and watched the clear river flow, which reflected the jade bone mask on his face. There were no less than 100 followers of the Yinma cult hiding around him. Looking around, there was no pedestrian. "Young master, will he really come?" Ling Mo wore a black and red robe, and his whole face was covered in a cloak, which made people couldn't see clearly. Even if he didn't emit his breath, his clothes were enough to make people tremble when they saw him in the martial arts circle. The leader of the Blood Tower was obviously the legendary leader of the Blood Tower. But at this moment, the killer of Shalu cult was full of strange feelings. He saw that Ling Li changed his previous plain dressing style and wore red clothes. If he didn't know the situation, he might think that Ling Li was going to get married today. Ling Mo quickly thought of the reason, because the figure of Mr. Li in cyan appeared in his mind. Ling Mo couldn't help but smile. He even cared about the color. Young master was surprisingly naive when talking about private affairs. "You ask me, but who should I ask?" Ling Li responded angrily. Obviously, he was not in a good mood. His performance these days. Even a stone-hearted person should be melted into molten iron. However, Su Li's heart was made of diamonds, and she didn't waver at all. Ling Mo obediently shut up. He wanted to say that maybe Miss Su Li even threw the gift box directly into the warehouse. How could she know that they were waiting for her here today? However, thinking that young master's temper was rising these days, he consciously didn't say much. In a twinkling of an eye, the sky gradually darkened. Ling Li stood by the river for 6 hours like a sculpture. Slight footsteps suddenly came. Ling Li's eyes were slightly bright, and he suddenly turned his head. His slightly surprised face immediately faded, and he couldn't help but feel disappointed. The person was not Su Li, but a kind old man in a black Taoist robe with a thin face. Third Elder. When Ling Mo saw him, he slightly bowed his head to salute. This person was a member of the Elders' Union of the Yinma cult who hadn't come out for a long time. At that time, Ling Li could ascend to the position of hierarch thanks to the help of the first elder and him. The kind old man slightly nodded as a response. He looked at Ling Li and said with a smile, "Hierarch, you have been here for a long time. Are you waiting for someone?" Ling Li slightly frowned and replied in a low voice, "It's a matter of great importance. It's better to act when it is dark. Hierarch, it's a blessing for our holy cult that you are considerate." The third elder said happily and no longer entangled in the previous problem. But he kept a thought in his mind. On the one hand, he came to Yunjing City for the safety of Ling Li, and on the other hand, he came because of the secret message of the holy girl. If Hierarch really ruined the great event of the holy cult because of his love affair, he must stop it before it happened. The sun was setting, and the night shrouded the riverside. Ling Qinglan dressed as a cyan fox and came here directly from the Supreme Judiciary. He stood aside quietly and waited for the opportunity. Today's plan was planned by him, but he didn't expect that Ling Li mobilized so many people. However, after seeing the third elder, he understood that with the help of the longevity realm, they could completely evacuate before the Dongfang family reacted. "Master, it's almost time." Ling Mo reminded him in a low voice. Ling Li suddenly came to his sense. He was full of disappointment and wanted to give orders. Suddenly, a boat came into everyone's sight in the river. The person in the bow was dressed in red gauze and wore a jade bone mask similar to Ling Li's. She floated in front of Ling Li in a blink of an eye. "You?" Ling Li's eyes were filled with surprise. He couldn't help but step forward to hold Su Li's hand. Su Li didn't resist and walked down the boat gently. "Hierarch, you even put this mask," the third elder was shocked. He was one of the most senior elders of the Yinmo cult. He knew clearly what this mask represented. "Yes," Ling Li said with certainty. His black hair fluttered without wind. "I'm the hierarch, and I should choose the madam." "Third elder, do you have any objection?" "The hierarch is the supreme leader of the holy cult." "I naturally have no objection." The third elder quickly expressed his opinion, and then hesitated, "But this matter is of great importance. Whether this person has the ability. I'm afraid I have to ask the madam to go to the elders' conference. This matter can be discussed later." "Don't be too hasty," Ling Li said, and his heart was beating fast. His hand holding Su Li was slightly sweaty. He was afraid that Su Li would slap him in the face and leave in the next moment. But Su Li seemed to be a different person when she put on the mask. No matter what Ling Li said, she remained silent. This made Ling Li happy, but he couldn't help but feel worried. Everyone started to take action. Ling Li took Su Li to sit on the hierarch's jade carriage. The gauze curtain fluttered in the night wind, like a fairyland. But the scene inside the gauze curtain was a little embarrassing. Ling Li held the soft as cream and was reluctant to let go. But Su Li was so obedient, which made him a little flustered. After the atmosphere was silent for a moment, he finally couldn't help but transmit the sound in silence. "Are you, really Su Li?" Su Li turned her head, and her eyes flashed through the mask. Ling Li unexpectedly read a little shame and annoyance in her eyes. "Do you like to hold other women's hands?" The cold words came into Ling Li's ears, and he suddenly broke into a cold sweat. God bless him. Except for Su Li, he had never had skin contact with other women. Even Ling Xian only served tea and never entered his bedroom. Subconsciously, Ling Li held her hand tighter and whispered in Su Li's ear, "Except for you, no one else." Su Li slightly raised the corner of her mouth. Ling Li glimpsed it, and she immediately giggled. Fortunately, there was a mask to cover her face. Otherwise, if her appearance was seen by the followers, they would doubt whether it was their hierarch who was sitting in the carriage now. Such details naturally couldn't escape the eyes of the third elder. He couldn't help but turn his head and sigh, "Hierarch, you should pay attention to your image." "I can't stand it." Ling Li straightened up and couldn't help but laugh out loud. "Do you want me to find a good match for you?" "No, no, no." The third elder shook his head quickly and waved his hand. "I'm already half dead." "Hierarch, you don't need to worry about me." While talking and laughing, the atmosphere was much relaxed, and Ling Li secretly breathed a sigh of relief. If the third elder also denied Su Li, things would be troublesome. He admitted that he was a little selfish. He didn't want to give up Su Li and revenge. At this moment, the third elder had other thoughts in his mind. Although he couldn't see the woman's face clearly because of the mask, it didn't prevent him from peeping at her cultivation. If he couldn't see through her, there were only two results. One was that the woman's cultivation broke through the longevity realm and reached the level that he could only look up to. The second possibility was that she was immortal. Even in the spiritual circle, there was no one who broke through the longevity realm. He naturally preferred the latter. It was the most prudent thing for the hierarch to marry a wife. However, the doctrine of the hierarch was unrestrained. Even if Lingli married a mortal, he wouldn't have any opinion. However, for the sake of Lingli, he still hoped that the hierarch could marry a person in the martial arts circle. Otherwise, it would evolve into an irreversible tragedy. In the history of the hierarch, there were some hierarch who married a mortal. But how could a mortal understand the martial arts circle which was bleeding every day? Finally, because of the stupidity of the hierarch's wife, the hierarch almost destroyed the hierarch. If the hierarch hadn't come to his senses, killed his wife by himself, and finally committed suicide in front of the memorial tablets of the hierarch to apologize. All these could only be described as tragic. Hierarch, you have read the ancient books of the hierarch. Why did you jump into the fire pit? Chapter 247. At night, there were few pedestrians on the road in Yunjing City. Lingli had prepared for this. No outsider could see them on the road. In a twinkling of an eye, the carriage stopped outside a big house. Su Li looked up and saw the words, Tang's Mansion. Even in the dim moonlight, it was still shining. Prime Minister Tang's Mansion. Su Li was slightly shocked. Why did Lingli come here with great fanfare? The followers of the Yinma cult didn't hide their tracks. The movement outside was soon discovered by the people of Prime Minister Tang's mansion. The timid gatekeeper saw the dense crowd outside through the crack of the door. He was so scared that his face turned pale. He immediately went to report. At this moment, Ling Qinglan's disguised voice came through the wall into the mansion. It was clear and loud. The hierarch of the hidden sacred cult is here. Why doesn't the owner of the mansion come out to meet him? Prime Minister Tang, who had fallen asleep, was awakened. He had no time to put on his clothes. He only wore a white shirt and opened the door. The panicked gatekeeper immediately fell in and said, "Master, it's bad. There are many people in black outside. They have surrounded the mansion." Prime Minister Tang heard it, but he didn't panic. He was a senior who had experienced 2 dynasties. He was calm in the face of danger. He called the butler and said, "Hurry up. Arrange Madam and others to leave through the secret passage." The butler smiled bitterly and said, "Master, the secret passage suddenly collapsed a few days ago. It is being repaired. Now even a sparrow can't get out, let alone Madam and others." What? Prime Minister Tang was horrified. His lips couldn't help trembling. When did it collapse? Why didn't you tell me before it was so important? The butler was puzzled and said, "Isn't it your order to repair the secret passage?" How? Prime Minister Tang's body trembled violently and he couldn't stop staggering. If the housekeeper hadn't come forward to help him, he would have fallen down. "Master, the butler looked worried. Prime Minister Tang waved his hand weakly and sighed, "I'm fine." Open the door to welcome the distinguished guests. "Yes, master." The butler ran to the door anxiously. Prime Minister Tang followed him slowly. He was expressionless. Obviously, they came prepared. In this case, it was a blessing, not a curse. If it was a curse, they couldn't avoid it, so there was no need to struggle. Boom boom, the tall and heavy door was pushed open by the 2 gatekeepers, producing a heavy sound that was unusually ear-piercing in the quiet night. Seeing this scene, Lingli waved his hand, and the man who carried the jade chariot immediately walked in. Ling Mo and Ling Qinglong were on each side of the chariot. Prime Minister Tang was shocked by such a situation. The two red figures on the carriage were covered by a curtain, so he couldn't see them clearly. But the people on both sides of the carriage were easy to recognize. They were two generals of the Yinma cult, Qinghu and Xuelo. There was no need to guess who was qualified to sit in the carriage. The hierarch of the Yinma cult, Child Li. I am Prime Minister Tang. Greetings, sect leader Li. Prime Minister Tang said and was about to kneel down with the help of the butler. The hierarch of a big sect was no less than the king of a country like Dongfang Shao. It was not inappropriate for him to kneel down to greet him. Haha, hearty laughter came from the chariot, and a gentle voice sounded, Mr. Tang, you don't have to be so polite. It would be bad if Dongfang Shao misunderstood you. Hearing this, Su Li's eyes flickered, and she seemed to understand something. Prime Minister Tang found that there was a force under his knees when he was kneeling halfway. He couldn't kneel down no matter how hard he tried. He immediately straightened up, but he was inexplicably frightened. He was not afraid of Child Li's martial force, but his intention. So many people of the Yinma cult appeared in the Tang mansion. If there were no casualties in the Tang mansion, the Dongfang family would know about it. According to Dongfang Zhao's suspicious character, how could the Tang mansion end well? The expression change on Prime Minister Tang's face couldn't escape Ling Li's eyes. He still laughed, and a slightly flat voice came into Prime Minister Tang's ears. It seems that Mr. Tang is a sensible person. I don't want to keep you guessing. This king has come here personally to inquire about something. If old Mister's answer can satisfy this king, perhaps I can guarantee the safety of your Tang residence. Prime Minister Tang snorted and said in a low voice, You set me up like this. How can I trust your sect? No. Mr. Tang misunderstood. Ling Li stretched out his hand and waved. Ling Mo immediately rushed into the backyard with people and Prime Minister Tang's frightened look. After a scream of fear, all the womenfolk of the Tang mansion were gathered in the front yard. They were controlled by the Yinma cult and shivered. Among them, Tang Lei was the one who shook the most. His fat shook quite rhythmically. The teenager next to him, who seemed to be 1 or 2 years younger than Tang Lei, was not much better. Although he tried to maintain a gloomy and calm face, his face was pale like a piece of paper. Su Li covered her mouth and chuckled. She thought that if Tang Lei continued to shake like this, he might lose a lot of fat. This time, Ling Li accurately grasped Prime Minister Tang's weakness, so there was no possibility of failure. Therefore, in Prime Minister Tang's view, Hierarch Li seemed to be a devil who killed people without blinking. But in fact, Ling Li would not kill anyone. The third elder had been paying attention to Su Li's movements. Seeing that she could still laugh, he was a little relieved. Although this woman was immortal, she was indeed extraordinary. It was the best for the holy cult that she could accept the fighting and killing in the martial arts circle. Prime Minister Tang's face was pale. He scolded himself for being stupid. He even tried to trust a devil. It didn't matter if he died alone. But all the lineal relatives of the Tang mansion were here. If they were really killed by the Yinma cult, the Tang family would be dead. How could he explain to the ancestors of the Tang family after he died? Soon, Prime Minister Tang gave up the inner struggle and relaxed. He accepted his fate and said, Hierarchically, what do you want to ask? Mr. Tang, you are really sensible. Ling Li praised and then asked, 14 years ago, you were the minister of the Ministry of Penalty. So, you should know a lot about the extermination of the Yi family. When Prime Minister Tang heard 14 years ago, his face immediately changed. The words of Minister of the Ministry of Penalty and Yi family were taboo for him. Tang Lei looked at Prime Minister Tang in confusion. His grandfather used to be the minister of the Ministry of Penalty. Why didn't he know? This matter should have nothing to do with your cult. Why are you interested in a matter that happened 14 years ago? Prime Minister Tang took a deep breath and managed to calm down. I don't need a reason to do things. Even if I have a reason, you are not qualified to inquire about it. So, it's wise to tell me who killed the Yi family while I am in a good mood. Ling Li's words were extremely arrogant. It was obvious that he didn't take anyone in the Tang mansion seriously. The teenager beside Tang Lei was so angry that he even forgot his fear. But his reason told him that it was better not to talk back. Ling Li was indeed qualified to be arrogant. Prime Minister Tang was silent and fell into endless struggle. Ling Li stopped Ling Qinglan from asking questions several times. He waited slowly. At this time, he couldn't be anxious. If the people in the Tang mansion found out, they couldn't ask anything. Prime Minister Tang's expression changed. From time to time, he looked at his wife and children who were full of hope. But if he said it and Dongfang Xiao knew it, the Tang family couldn't escape death. Besides, they would be engraved with the crime of treason, which would bring shame to the family. Mr. Tang, you have to think clearly. If you don't say it, you will also be regarded as a thorn in the side of the Dongfang family. If I add fuel to the fire, you can imagine the result. If you say it, the result will be completely different. Ling Li continued to persuade Prime Minister Tang patiently. This sentence was exactly what Prime Minister Tang wanted. That was right. The Dahan country had been infiltrated by the Yinma cult for a long time. If the Yinma cult took advantage of today's event to publicize it, all the vows he made in front of Dongfang Xiao would be invalid. The Tang family was not the retainer of the Dongfang family. He just kept his mouth shut to save his life. Now, did he want to keep the secret and go to hell? I will say it. After saying it, Prime Minister Tang seemed to put down a heavy burden, and the wrinkles on his face were stretched out. He said, I believe that Hierarchy, who is famous in the martial arts circle, will not deceive me. Prime Minister Tang is really sensible. Ling Li chuckled and signaled Ling Mo. Ling Mo immediately understood and took all the women and children of the Tang family back to the backyard to guard. At the same time, he also took Su Li's hand and got off the jade carriage. Their red clothes were like fire. They looked like a couple who had just gotten married. It turns out that Hierarch's wife is also here. I'm really scared. Prime Minister Tang was surprised and quickly saluted. It was said that Child Li had no wife in Jianghu. In this way, he was the first outsider to know this information. He couldn't help but feel a sense of honor. Su Li nodded slightly to return the salute. Prime Minister Tang's indifferent reaction was expected. The third elder also nodded secretly. It was rare for an ordinary person of the Dahan country to be so calm in front of the Prime Minister of the country. He believed that even if she met Dongfang Xiao, what she did would not bring shame to the cult. She was worthy of the title of the hostess of the holy cult. Soon, Prime Minister Tang, Ling Li and Su Li sat in the front hall. Except for Ling Qinglan who stood behind Ling Li to listen, Ling Mo and the third elder didn't come in. They just guarded outside the door in case of accidents. Hierarchy and Madam are really in love with each other. Prime Minister Tang saw that Ling Li was unwilling to let go of his hand and sighed. He was a little too relaxed at the moment and didn't have much fear in front of the notorious devil. Ling Li coughed and acquiesced to what Prime Minister Tang said. He didn't dare to see Su Li's reaction and changed the topic. Mr. Tang, let's talk about the Yi family. Okay. Chapter 248. At that time, I just became the minister of the Ministry of Penalty. Although I had the support of my family, I was enthusiastic and wanted to reorganize the laws of Dahan country. But the case of the Yi family made it impossible for me to realize my dream. Prime Minister Tang recalled what happened in those years and felt sorry now. Hierarchically, although I don't know why you are interested in a family in Dahan country, I'm sorry to tell you that I don't know much about the fire of the Ministry of Penalty, but, Mr. Tang, don't keep me guessing. My time is precious. Let's get to the point. Ling Li said lightly, but he was worried as Su Li and Ling Qinglan. They all knew that what he was going to say next was the highlight. The case of the extermination of the Yi family is really full of doubts. Prime Minister Tang didn't say any more nonsense and said directly, all the members of the Yi family were killed with one blow. And the way of death was not the same. The murderer was not one person. It was more like an organization full of discipline. I'm not afraid to blame you, but I thought you did it at first. Prime Minister Tang stared at Ling Li's reaction, but he didn't see any clue. Ling Li chuckled, which was quite harsh on Prime Minister Tang's ears. Although I'm not a good person, the Yi family has never had anything to do with our cult before. Why should I kill the Holy Family? Ling Li's tone was full of disdain, but he said it clearly. Although Prime Minister Tang was old, he still had the ability to distinguish the truth. He was silent for a moment and suddenly said, in fact, General Yi Qing and I were old friends. Ling Qinglan held his breath and subconsciously clenched his fists. It was the first time for him to hear the name of his grandfather from others in 14 years. Back then, General Yi Qing was General Ling's most valued right-hand man. He was indeed extremely intelligent and his brain worked extremely fast. General Ling would always ask for his opinion on all the major and minor decisions in the military camp. It could be said that although Yi Qing was only a deputy general, he played an incomparably important role as a military advisor in the camp. Ling Li also looked serious. There was very little information about his grandfather and father in his mind, so he didn't know the situation in the military camp at that time. Before the assassination, he didn't really regard himself as a member of the Ling family. Therefore, he pretended while concentrating on practicing, thinking about how to return to the earth. Now, with his constant exploration and understanding of the world, he had long given up the idea of returning to the earth. According to the scientific theory on the earth, this place might not be the same space as the earth. No matter how he practiced, it was impossible for him to break the plane and go back. Ling Li was distracted. Prime Minister Tang continued to say, I had an encounter with Yi Qing, and later, we became bosom friends. Yi Qing and I had a close relationship with him. Yi of world. Tang I of world. Yi Qing and Tang of Tang were Li at Qing and of Li of Tang Li, Qing, Li, Prime Dynasty, Tang Prime said. Ling Li was touched, and his eyebrows twitched. He suddenly said in a cold tone, is the extermination of the Yi family really related to the Ling family? Prime Minister Tang was slightly startled. He nodded and then shook his head. It seems that Hierarch is a wise man. However, this old man is only guessing. After all, the deaths of the Ling family men are too strange. Since the extermination of the Yi family, the Ling family has been in danger again and again. In the following 6 years, General Ling and the eldest son of the Ling family died one after another. Finally, the second son of the Ling family died. I am also curious. If the power of the Ling family is really reduced, why not eliminate Ling Ping? Leaving the useless third master, the Ling family naturally can't make waves. The older the ginger, the spicier it is. Old Mr. Tang's eyes are as sharp as a torch. Although Ling Li's words were compliments, Prime Minister Tang couldn't hear any emotion of praise, as if there were only ice in Ling Li's words without any personal feelings. His heart couldn't help but shiver slightly, and his brain began to work. Anyone would speak with emotion, and the disdain and arrogance in this cult Master Li's words could be counted as well. Now that he suddenly had no emotion, he was naturally suppressing something. But even if he noticed the abnormality, he couldn't guess the relationship between the hierarch of the Enma cult and the Ling family with this clue. Hierarch, you flatter me. Prime Minister Tang didn't dare to ask for credit. He knew that Ling Li didn't really praise him, so he immediately continued, not long before the extermination of the Yi family, I had a private meeting with Yi Qing to drink. At that time, I noticed that he was worried and his whole state was not right. I asked him again and again, but he didn't say anything. Finally, I don't know if he was drunk, he suddenly told me that he found a big secret. Ling Li raised his eyebrows and asked, what secret? I also asked him at that time, but he soon came to his senses and seemed to regret spilling the beans. Then he kept silent and only said that he would tell me the details after it was done. Later, the Yi family was exterminated. Prime Minister Tang was full of regret. He still remembered that Yi Qing was very hesitant at that time. If he insisted on it, maybe he could know what the secret was. Unfortunately, Yi Qing was dead, and no one would know the secret forever. After talking for so long, is old Mr. Tang trying to say that's all he knows? Ling Qinglan said coldly. He was full of expectation, but Prime Minister Tang told him this. He was disappointed and angry because he was teased by Prime Minister Tang. Lord Qinghu, please calm down. Prime Minister Tang knew the current situation. He fell from the chair without dignity and knelt on the ground, later. The most important thing is after the extermination of the Yi family. Come on, Qinghu, don't scare the old man. If he is scared, who can I ask for help? Ling Li waved his hand. It seemed that he was reprimanding him, but in fact, he was warning Ling Qinglan to be more calm at this time. Ling Qinglan took a deep breath, relaxed and stopped talking. Well, go on. Ling Li said carelessly. He held Su Li's right hand in his palm and gently rubbed it. It seemed that his attention was not on the information at all. Prime Minister Tang didn't dare to neglect and immediately began to talk about the key points. At that time, I saw a lot of firewood and kerosene around the Yi family. I knew that the murderers must want to burn the corpses. So, I immediately decided to transport all the corpses to the Ministry of Penalty overnight and check Yi Qing's body in person. Su Li's eyes flashed with light. Her only confidant and friend died in front of her. It was hard to imagine how Prime Minister Tang calmed down quickly and made a decision. Although the old man gave up his dignity in order to protect his family, which was a bit humble, it didn't prevent her from admiring him. Yi Qing was disfigured after his death. It's hard to tell anything from his expression. His lips and teeth were broken, and his fingers were broken. He died very painfully. Prime Minister Tang's voice changed a little. It seemed that he recalled the tragedy of that year. Someone tortured him, wanting to know something. If I'm not mistaken, his entire family was annihilated because of that secret. I wanted to go to the original site of the Yi family to investigate at that time, but the Ministry of Penalty suddenly caught fire. I was also attacked from behind and fainted. When I woke up, I was already in my own home. All the corpses of the Yi family were burned into charcoal. It was impossible to tell who was who. Even half of the warehouse where the files were stored was burned. Countless officers of the Ministry of Penalty also died. Prime Minister Tang lowered his head in pain. Such a big accident had never happened since the founding of the Dahan country. When I received the news at that time, I thought it was over. I couldn't bear such a big crime. Maybe the whole Tang family would be killed. Then, the next day, I received a secret summon from the Imperial Palace. Su Li's eyes wandered. 14 years ago, the emperor of the Dahan country was still Dongfang Shao. At that time, Dongfang Shao had just pacified the civil strife in the Imperial Palace for less than 2 years. His behavior was very radical. I went to the imperial palace with the thought of losing my head, but I saw an emperor with a kind smile. Thinking of the emperor, Prime Minister Tang still shuddered. He promised me that as long as I kept the matter of the Yi family in my heart forever, the fire of the Ministry of Penalty would not be investigated. Besides, my traces in the Ministry of Penalty would also be erased, and I would have a bright career. So, you agreed? Ling Qinglan's voice was cold, even with a hint of killing intent. Although in that case, anyone would agree in order to save his life, he was a member of the Yi family. He was destined not to consider Prime Minister Tang's feelings. Surprisingly, Prime Minister Tang shook his head. Yi Qing is my only confidant. Although my life was in danger, still hesitated at that time. Prime Minister Tang looked calm. What he said at the moment was true, so he naturally had a clear conscience. My hesitation was not a good thing in Dongfang Zhao's eyes. He quickly issued an order, an inhumane order. Prime Minister Tang's voice became bitter. He caught all the people of the Tang family who worked in the Ministry of Penalty. Every time I hesitated for a quarter of an hour, someone would be beheaded. Ling Qinglan was finally moved. He restrained his killing intent and faintly felt a little guilty. If Prime Minister Tang really struggled for the Yi family would be indebted to him. But he just wanted to kill Prime Minister Tang. Dongfang Zhao didn't give me much time. He said a quarter of an hour, but the eunuch immediately caught someone and beheaded him. Prime Minister Tang looked ferocious. I almost rushed to fight with him, but the eunuch caught Lei and pressed him on the guillotine. Ling Li narrowed his eyes slightly. Tang Lei was the same age as him, which meant that Tang Lei was just a 2-year-old baby at that time. The silly boy was about to die, but he could still smile when he looked at the eunuch who caught him. Prime Minister Tang scolded, but his voice couldn't stop trembling. He shouted crazily, "He is my first grandson. I want to hold him in my palm. How can I bear that he just came to this world and go back to the underworld?" Chapter 249. With Prime Minister Tang's last words, the front hall fell into silence for a long time. Everyone had their own thoughts and no one spoke. Su Li looked at Prime Minister Tang, who knelt on the ground and expressed his true feelings. She was deep in thought. Tang Lei was not favored by Prime Minister Tang at all. Otherwise, how could he develop such a cowardly character? He lived in the Ling mansion for several months, but no one cared about the Tang mansion. But in this case, Prime Minister Tang would not lie. Ling Li and Ling Qinglan could also think of what Su Li thought. They talked for a while, and Ling Qinglan stood up and asked, "Mr. Tang, you claim that you love your eldest grandson, but I don't have to investigate to know that your eldest grandson has never been favored since he was a child. He was even left to fend for himself outside. Only your second son has been raised carefully and is regarded as the future heir of the Tang family. Don't you feel that it is contradictory?" Ho ho, Prime Minister Tang gave a wry smile and was not surprised to hear this question. "Lord Qinghu, I am relieved to hear that. Since you didn't find any clue, the royal family should not either. I painstakingly put Lei out of my sight. I just hope that he can continue to live after I die. If I may be so bold as to ask, is your wife still alive?" Su Li suddenly asked. Although she used a falsetto voice, her tone was still pleasant. Prime Minister Tang subconsciously imagined a beautiful woman's face in his mind. "You are so polite. I'm really flattered." It seemed that Prime Minister Tang was relieved after telling everything. No matter what he said at this moment, he seemed calm. Madam Sect Master's guess is correct. Ever since that year, my wife and daughter-in-law's health deteriorated year by year. In the end, they passed away one after another. Shortly after that, Dongfang Zhao sent several successors to me. Although I had some guesses at that time, I didn't dare to think deeply. I even abandoned myself to despair. I had already surrendered once, so what if I was weak again? Later, Tang Ping was born. After that, Lei's situation was getting worse. I couldn't take him with me all the time, so I could only reduce my attention to him so that he could live. Su Li sneered, "You are so naive. Do you think that if you take a step back, Dongfang Xiao will give your Tang family more opportunities?" Prime Minister Tang was shocked and asked in a trembling voice, "What do you mean? How can you understand my wife's meaning?" "Prime Minister Tang, why are you deceiving yourself?" Ling Li stared at Ling Li's side face. There was only tenderness and affection in his eyes, but his tone was cold and hard. "The backyard of your Tang family has been nibbled away by Dongfang Xiao. Although some of your sons are still alive, none of them is an official in the imperial court. It can be said that as long as you die, your sense of existence in the imperial court will fade away, and your wife will immediately destroy your Tang family. How is this possible? No matter what, they have already stepped through the door of my Tang family and are members of my Tang family." Prime Minister Tang's eyes were full of disbelief. He suddenly stood up and retorted. His neck became red because of the rapid ups and downs of his emotions. "So, Mr. Tang, you are really naive." Ling Li waved his hand and pulled Su Li to get up and leave the front hall. He said lightly, "Finally, I would like to remind you that the first child of your mansion has been poisoned for several years. This poison causes him to be fat and slow in thinking. He has become a waste. That's all I have to say. Take care of yourself, Mr. Tang." Then, Ling Li and Su Li disappeared from the gate of the Ling family and returned to the jade carriage. Before Prime Minister Tang recovered from the shock, he saw that Ling Qinglan walked a few steps out and then turned back and said, "Mr. Tang, don't worry about the exposure. People within 10 miles around the Tang family are sleeping soundly. Even if there is an explosion in 6 hours, they will not wake up. Mr. Tang only spent a little more than 2 hours. Naturally, you don't have to worry about it." Prime Minister Tang stared blankly at the Yinma cult's followers retreating silently like ghosts and soon disappeared in the empty street. Master, are you all right?" A group of people came into the backyard. Prime Minister Tang looked at his second wife who was 20 years younger than him expressionlessly and didn't speak. Although the woman was over 40 years old, she was well maintained and looked only over 30 years old. She was Tang Ping's biological mother, Dongfang Wan. "Master, is everything okay in the Tang family? I heard that a thief broke into the Prime Minister's house. How dare he steal from the Prime Minister's house?" Dongfang Wan looked indignant, but her words made Prime Minister Tang confused. They all saw the hierarch of the Yinma cult just now. Why did they all seem to have lost their memories? Although confused, Prime Minister Tang had lived for 60 or 70 years, so he was shrewd. He immediately suppressed his thoughts and nodded slightly, "It's okay. Although we didn't catch the thief, nothing was lost in the Tang family. Go back to sleep." "Yes, Master." The crowd gradually dispersed. Tang Ping glanced at Tang Lei who was still in a daze. He sneered and said with concern, "Grandpa, you should also have an early rest." Prime Minister Tang shook his head, "It's almost time for the morning court. You can have a rest when you come back. You are 16 or 17 years old, and you are growing up. You can leave now." Tang Ping was satisfied with Prime Minister Tang's concern. He glanced at Tang Lei arrogantly and immediately left the front hall. After Tang Ping left, there was only Tang Lei in the room. Facing his grandfather alone, Tang Lei was scared. He lowered his head and shrank his neck, just like a fat ostrich. Prime Minister Tang was sad in his heart, but he pretended to be disgusted and reprimanded, "Bastard. You have been fooling around outside recently. Do you want to abandon your home? The sudden reprimand made Tang Lei confused. He couldn't help but feel wronged. I didn't. How dare you quibble? Prime Minister Tang grabbed Tang Lei's ear and walked to the study. Grandpa, be gentle. It hurts. The maid who peeped outside the door saw this scene and laughed in her heart. She quickly left the front hall and ran to the backyard. The light in the study flickered. Tang Lei knelt on the ground in fear and didn't dare to breathe. Prime Minister Tang sat in the chair without saying a word, but he was shocked in his heart. The Yinma cult could erase people's memories. It was terrible. He finally understood what Qinghu meant by no worries. Originally, he was worried that Dongfang Wan would secretly inform the royal family, but now it was impossible. Grandpa. Tang Lei's feet were numb after kneeling for a long time. He couldn't help but ask, Grandpa, is the person who came tonight? Shut up. Prime Minister Tang's face suddenly changed. He looked at Tang Lei in surprise and doubt. Did the method of erasing memories fail? The Yinma cult was meticulous and should not miss anything. Tang Lei covered his mouth with his hands and was frightened. He didn't dare to speak again. Prime Minister Tang's fierceness really scared him. You, come with me. With a sigh, Prime Minister Tang got up and walked to the bedroom. Tang Lei followed him nervously. He saw that his grandpa turned a switch under the bed. The place where the wardrobe was moved, revealing an entrance to a secret room. Tang Lei was shocked. How could there be such a place in his grandpa's bedroom? What are you waiting for? Come in. Prime Minister Tang's voice came. Tang Lei hurriedly said, "Oh," and walked in. Because the door was too small, his huge body was almost embedded in the door frame. Prime Minister Tang shook his head. Now that he knew the secret of his eldest grandson being fat, he certainly wouldn't blame him as before. After Tang Lei came in, Prime Minister Tang turned the switch, and the bookcase was closed quietly. At the same time, Prime Minister Tang also lit the oil lamp. Grandpa, what is this place? Tang Lei was curious. He was surprised to find that the lines on his grandpa's face softened. He only saw the kind eyes of his grandpa when he looked at Tang Ping. Lei, you have grown up. I don't want to hide many things from you. Prime Minister Tang sighed and told Tang Ping the secrets hidden in his heart these years. Tang Lei opened his mouth and couldn't close it for a long time. Did his grandpa take the wrong medicine? Or was he making up a story? Why did he feel it was not true at all? However, when he heard that his mother and his grandmother had died mysteriously one after another, his expression was no longer as relaxed as it was before. It slowly became gloomy, and he fell into a long silence. Lei, I am useless. I don't know when the royal family will kill me. You are the only hope of our Tang family. You must live well. Prime Minister Tang gently patted his grandson's fat shoulder and said, Tonight, I will take you to see a doctor. The hierarch of the Yinma cult didn't erase your memory. I also realized that he had known that I would take you to detoxify the poison. Now it saves me a lot of trouble. Grandpa, I am fine. Tang Lei smirked, which made people feel sorry for him. He said, I have found a doctor who can detoxify the poison. What? Prime Minister Tang was shocked. He thought that his grandson had been kept in the dark, but it turned out that he was the last one to know it. I have wronged you before. It's really a sin. Tang Lei's eyes were clear. Since Su Li suppressed the poison in his body, he thought a lot during this time and was no longer as stupid as before. No matter how slow your grandson's body is, if I'm about to die, I'll still be able to feel something. Thinking of the beautiful figure in the affiliated school of the National Academy, Tang Lei's fat face showed great gratitude. He said, in fact, a few months ago, I felt that my physical strength declined sharply. I was out of breath after a few steps. Later, by chance, a great doctor suppressed the poison with an elixir. I have always wondered why that doctor didn't detoxify the poison in my body since she could easily suppress it. Later, I realized that she was afraid of alerting the enemy and killing me. Chapter 250. Prime Minister Tang was shocked when he heard Tang Lei's bold words. In his impression, his eldest grandson had always been a yes-man, overcautious and timid in everything he did, but it turned out that it was not Tang Lei's true temperament. After figuring it out, Prime Minister Tang couldn't help but laugh and said, "Lei, what you said today really broadened my horizons. You didn't lose the face of our Tang family." Tang Lei scratched his head embarrassedly and said with a smile, "I'm just telling the truth. I've been blinded these years. It's not too late for me to be enlightened by you." Prime Minister Tang's old face was a little more relaxed and relieved. "Don't worry about it. Continue to contact the doctor and let him detoxify you. Then live in the Ling family and never come back. I know what to do with the Emo cult." Prime Minister Tang was anxious and said, "Grandpa, you must not take risks." Prime Minister Tang shook his head and said with a smile, "If I want to win a glimmer of vitality for the Tang family, how can I not take risks? Don't worry. I want to see a great-grandson. I won't take risks easily." Tang Lei was a little relieved when he heard it. His ears suddenly turned red and he said shyly, "I'm so fat. How can a girl like me, after you detoxify, lose weight for me?" "Yes, Grandpa." Tang Lei nodded hurriedly. At this moment, his heart was warmer than ever. In the night, Prime Minister Tang watched his eldest grandson leave. His eyes full of vicissitudes immediately became cold and full of determination. He was confused and ruined the future of the Tang family. If it wasn't for the visit of the Emo cult tonight, he might not realize it until the news of Tang Lei's death came. "Ancestors, I'm willing to go to hell to suffer after death. Ancestors, please bless me. I'll use my life to seek a glimmer of vitality for Lei." Nothing happened that night. The first glimmer of light in the morning shone on the earth. Fong Yuan opened the attic on the top floor with a broom as usual and was about to go in to clean. But when he saw the woman in red lying on the soft mattress in the room, he immediately froze and didn't know what to do. "When the purple qi came from the east, why didn't you seize the time to cultivate? Why did you come to my house?" Su Li suddenly opened her eyes. Although Fong Yuan's steps were light, she found it at the first time. Hearing that, Fong Yuan showed a rare embarrassment on his face. He explained in a low voice, "I have too many distracting thoughts, so I want to clean it." "Have you always cleaned this room yourself?" An unknown light flashed through Su Li's eyes, and Fong Yuan's silent heart immediately beat faster. He didn't know how to answer. Could he tell her that he had snatched this job from his sister's hands and had been laughed at for a few days? "Forget it. I haven't had many opportunities to fight recently. You've indeed been cultivating too much. It's best if you can find your own way to relax." She no longer entangled in the previous problem, or she didn't want to entangle. There was a hint of sadness in Fong Yuan's eyes, but he soon recovered his usual calmness. He didn't let Su Li see any clue. He took the broom and went down. Although his back was straight, he still showed some loneliness. A strange feeling flashed through Su Li's eyes. Fong Yuan's intention couldn't be more obvious, but unfortunately, shaking her head slightly to get rid of distracting thoughts, Su Li took out the full moon and heartstrings from her arms. The shell of the full moon and heartstrings had been removed. At this moment, it had completely melted in the glass bottle. Its color was no longer golden, but it was as clear as the sky, like blood. The way to use the full moon and heartstrings had been handed down. It was directly refined on the night of the full moon. But there was a more powerful way hidden in her heart. The ancient method of refining the mind. The shape of the full moon and heartstrings was like Jean Dan. Ordinary people naturally wanted to refine the whole thing. But later generations found that a layer of golden clothes on the surface of this spiritual object would suppress the effect of the full moon and heartstrings, and then it couldn't promote a higher level of the Zifu. It could be said that the full moon and heartstrings without the golden clothes was the real rare spiritual object. After peeling off the golden clothes, the core liquid of the full moon and heartstrings was milky white. Suli chose the first day of the first lunar month, at midnight, when the power of the moonlight was the weakest, to add 10 drops of her essence blood into it, so that the milky white liquid immediately turned into sky blue. The so-called essence blood was the essence of a warrior, which was extremely important. If a warrior lost a lot of essence blood at once, it was likely to lead to the decline of his cultivation, and even his life would be in danger. A warrior of the inborn realm had no more than 100 drops of essence blood. Suli forced out 1/10 of it at once. It could be imagined how great the cost was. Looking at the thing in the bottle, Suli didn't dare to be distracted. In order to refine this thing, she didn't hesitate to lower her cultivation. She had just reached the 8th hurdle of the inborn realm, but now she returned to the 7th hurdle of the inborn realm. There was only one chance, and she must not fail. Putting the glass bottle where the sun shone, Suli got up and walked to the door. She moved 2 large vases to block the door. The tactical matrix was set up. Unless Wen Tingshan forced it, no one could open the whole Linli building. Wen Tingshan was not a stupid person. What's more, after the auction, the people of the Wanjian sect didn't move for a long time. He finally couldn't help but set off to the Qinghe province to find Ningqing, so that Suli could refine the full moon and heartstrings without any accident. The time was getting closer and closer. Suli looked dignified and her forehead was slightly sweating. The enemies of the Wanjian sect, Dongfang Shao, the Hehuan sect and the Lianshi cult were getting stronger and stronger. She had no time to fail. The quiet waiting lasted for 5 minutes. Suddenly, a visible lavender pneuma floated from the nothingness and instantly integrated into the glass bottle. Suli's eyes were full of surprise and joy. It turned out to be the power of extreme yang. Crack! The heat wave hit, and the glass bottle broke as expected. Then it tended to melt. The sky blue liquid in the bottle became flame-like golden, and in the blink of an eye, it tended to become black. Suli's pupils shrank slightly. Without saying anything, she directly cupped the pool of gelatinous fiery red in her hands. Then her expression changed slightly. She looked at her right hand, which was wrapped by the inborn genuine energy. It was scorched black and emitted bursts of meat fragrance. In just an instant, he was roasted. In the next moment, Suli made a decision and swallowed the fiery red thing. It was no less than swallowing magma with flesh and blood. In the blink of an eye, Suli felt that the pipeline from her throat to her stomach was burned through, and then an unimaginable pain came from her stomach. Even a wisp of the power of the sun could not be borne by a mortal body. If there was no special way to deal with it, Suli would be burned into a charcoal black corpse in less than 5 minutes. The more critical the moment was, the calmer Suli appeared. Before using this method, she knew that it was extremely dangerous. Now everything was still within her expectation. The secret method that she had practiced for thousands of times emerged in her mind. She immediately ran all the strength in her body. Although the injury was very terrible, fortunately, only the respiratory tract and esophagus were destroyed, and only 20% of the tendons and vessels were destroyed. So, the secret method was running smoothly. Soon, the genuine energy was transformed into a kind of gentle power, which slowly wrapped the source of the golden color. The heat in the body faded away, and the outstanding recovery ability of the Ghost Valley meditation direction played a role. His cracked and blood-red lips regained their moisture at a speed visible to the naked eye. His hair, which was as dry as withered grass, regained its smoothness like ink. The hole in his body was recovering slowly, but it was still recovering. Finally, it's over. Suli looked inside her body, which was slowly healing a few black holes, but she dared not to be careless. The danger of practicing the ancient method of refined mind was more than that, although she felt that she was almost roasted just now. In the pubic region, the gentle power was constantly wearing down the power of the sun, and it was decomposed into countless small parts, which were transported to every part of Suli's tendons and vessels. Suli felt as if she was soaking in a hot spring, and her whole body was warm. This feeling lasted for a long time. The golden color of the full moon and heartstrings faded away, and it became the previous blue again. But this time, it was not sky blue, but deep blue. Without warning, an extremely horrible chill suddenly broke out, which easily broke through the gentle mysterious energy and instantly swept Suli's whole body. Katja, if someone walked into the room now, he could see that Suli's whole body was covered with a layer of frost, and the ice was thickening at a very fast speed. In the blink of an eye, even Suli's face could not be seen clearly. At this moment, the rising sun outside the window happened to shine on Suli, who was sitting on the ground with her legs crossed. The power of the sun in the daytime broke out, and immediately suppressed the power of the moon. The ice and snow melted quickly, and Suli returned to normal. But her expression was still stiff, as if she was frozen to death. As time went by, Fang Yuan and others came to knock on the door, but there was no response. They were worried and wanted to break the door by force, but they found that the wooden door was as heavy as a boulder, and they could not push it open at all. Finally, they could only helplessly wait outside the door, and they couldn't help worrying. Although Suli's words of "just making a deal" were still vivid in their ears, as if it were yesterday, people's hearts were revealed after a long time. They had already experienced Suli's temperament of being sharp-tongued but soft-hearted. At this moment, the situation in the room was shocking. The sun could not shine on the position where Suli was sitting, but there was a halo around her body, which was clearly the power of the sun. Time passed slowly. When the last trace of the power of the sun faded in the west, Suli, who was like an ice sculpture, suddenly opened her eyes, and then she could no longer maintain the posture of sitting cross-legged. She lay on the ground and gasped for breath. She stared at the white water marks on the ground that had already dried up, and her eyes were full of fear. She underestimated the power of the extreme yin contained in the full moon and heartstrings. This time, if there was no power of the sun that had been helping her, she would have been frozen to death at the moment when the chill broke out. But even so, she did not want to recall the process of refining the full moon and heartstrings. It was as difficult as a drowning child coming ashore alone in a drowning lake to struggle between ice and fire, and to keep sober to refine the full moon and heartstrings. It was really a nightmare. Fortunately, the suffering was over, and it was time to check the harvest. While sighing, Suli felt that she had recovered a lot of strength. She sat up again and looked inside her pubic region. The liquid genuine energy was rippling in the center of the pubic region like a lake. The quality and quantity of the lake had increased by more than 3 times. She ran the genuine energy slightly and couldn't help but be surprised. The inborn 9th hurdle. After refining the full moon and heartstrings for only 1 day, she directly skipped the inborn 8th hurdle and reached the inborn 9th hurdle. There was no bottleneck from the inborn 9th hurdle to the extreme of the inborn realm. In addition, there was still a lot of residual efficacy in her body. She could reach the peak in 1 month at most. One step further was the realm that the martial arts circle and the secular world looked up to, the longevity realm. Su Li's eyes flashed with a light. Such a risk didn't let her down after all. Originally, if she wanted to break through the longevity realm, she needed to take advantage of the rich nimbus environment of the spiritual circle, and she also needed to condense the embryonic form of her own immortal house to salvage the foundation. But now she didn't need it after refining the full moon and heartstrings with the ancient method. Looking inside with her psychic awareness, Su Li could see a little purple light flashing above her pubic region. That was the foundation of the immortal house. The power of the full moon and heartstrings wandered all over her body, and it would take some time for the immortal house to form. During this time, Su Li raised her right hand, and a little moonlight immediately sprinkled from the nothingness. The power of moonlight. The ancients didn't believe in her. Su Li was very happy. The fundamental purpose of refining the full moon and heartstrings with the ancient method was to master the ability to absorb the power of moonlight. The power of moonlight was everywhere and endless. On the night of the full moon, it would form a terrible tide of moonlight. Now she could absorb the spiritual power and the power of moonlight for her own use at the same time. She didn't need to worry about the energy and the immortal house. In the future, there would be no obstacle to break through the longevity realm. It is said that the shape of the immortal house of each warrior is different. I don't know what my immortal house will become. Su Li muttered to herself. If she refined the full moon and heartstrings on the night of the full moon, the immortal house would exist in the shape of the moon. Although the spherical shape had good defense, it was not a perfect shape. After refining the full moon and heartstrings with the ancient method, the shape of the immortal house would return to chaos. The shape of the immortal house depended on personal luck. No one could tell what the shape of Su Li's immortal house would be in the future. Su Li, can you hear me? Su Li, are you okay? Outside the door, Yin Xuedong and others heard Su Li's vague words. They immediately stood up and shouted at the door. At this moment, the Linli building was closed, so they were not afraid of being heard. As soon as Yin Xuedong finished speaking, the door opened with a squeak. Seeing Su Li's messy hair and wrinkled and blood-stained clothes, everyone was shocked immediately. Were you attacked? Feng Yuan frowned and asked in a low voice. He subconsciously protected Su Li behind him. His sharp eyes glanced around the room. Soon, his eyes fixed on the melted glass bottle on the table. At this moment, a trace of extremely horrible spiritual power leaked from Su Li. Feng Yuan seemed to fall into a cold abyss. His whole body was stiff and he couldn't move. Soon, the horrible feeling disappeared, but the horrible feeling was printed in his ears and mind. He slowly turned around and saw Su Li's helpless eyes. I have a breakthrough. I can't respond. Sorry to make you worry. Chu Qingming heard the words and immediately laughed. He said with great joy, I see. That's a good thing. Su Li, you broke through the inborn fifth hurdle a long time ago. Now you break the bottleneck and enter the late inborn hurdle. The strength of the Linli building has been greatly enhanced. Su Li smiled slightly. She didn't admit or deny it. Feng Yuan's eyes were full of complex feelings. He was the closest to Su Li just now. Only he knew that Su Li's cultivation was far more than the inborn sixth hurdle. Because of the hard practice these days, he had reached the inborn fifth hurdle. If Su Li was only in the inborn sixth hurdle, she couldn't give him such a horrible feeling. The inborn eighth hurdle, or, Feng Yuan subconsciously tightened his lips. He should protect Su Li, but from the beginning to the end, Su Li's cultivation was several levels higher than his. So, how could he say that? Sister Li is so powerful. Feng Ling happily held Su Li's arm and pulled Su Li away. She said, go to the bathhouse to take a bath and change clothes. I have prepared the same clothes for you. People in the Lord Roy's mansion can't find it. Speaking of the Lord Roy's mansion, Suli couldn't help but have a headache. She didn't know how to explain when she went back after she disappeared for a day and a half. After taking a bath and changing clothes, Fong Ling picked up the comb to comb Suli's hair. She didn't forget to admire, Sister Li's hair is so beautiful. Even if you don't comb it, it is still as soft. Hey, why does it feel longer? Fong Ling muttered. Suli looked at the girl's upturned mouth in the bronze mirror and couldn't help but laugh. She said, if you want it, why don't you work hard to practice the mental method I gave you? Fong Ling immediately sighed and said, Sister, I also want to practice hard to break through the inborn hurdle. But my talent is not as good as my brother. I am still in the 9th hurdle of the body refining realm. I really can't understand the AO sword skills at all. If I want to break through the inborn hurdle, I'm afraid I don't know when I will. The AO sword skills is only one of the ways to break through the inborn hurdle. If you don't have the talent to comprehend swordsmanship, this way may be too difficult for you. The inborn hurdle is the first step to communicate with the power of heaven and earth. In this case, you might as well choose to comprehend the world and nature. Suli broke through the inborn hurdle twice in 2 lives. She had rich experience. Her words immediately enlightened Fong Ling. I know, Sister Li. I won't stick to the AO sword skills in the future. Maybe I can break through the inborn hurdle with my own ability. Suli nodded slightly with a gentle smile on her face. Among all the people in the Linli building, Fong Ling's mind was the purest. Suli felt most comfortable staying with her. After dinner, Suli was about to leave at night. But Xian Jingzhou suddenly rushed in a panic. Fortunately, no one was on the first floor, so his real identity was not exposed. Mr. Li, is Mr. Li here? Xian Jingzhou rushed to the top floor and shouted. Suli, who had just changed into cyan clothes, opened the door and said in a deep voice, Boss Xian, why are you so anxious? The whereabouts of Mr. Li were erratic. Xian Jingzhou just came to try his luck. He didn't expect that Mr. Li was really in the Linli building. He was overjoyed and said hurriedly, my wife is ill. I hope Mr. Li can help me. Suli wanted to tease him, but when she heard that Su Yu had something to do, she immediately changed her mind and said, take me there. In the slightly dim back room of Zhouyue Winery, Suli sat in front of the bed and diagnosed Su Yu. It was a taboo to diagnose someone close to her. However, Xian Jingzhou didn't know the real identity of Mr. Li. Suli didn't want to delay, so she directly agreed. Behind Suli, Xian Jingzhou was concerned and his mind was on his wife. Next to Xian Jingzhou, Fang Yuan, Yin Xuedong, Chu Qingning and Fang Mu all came. Jingzhou, Siyu was looked at by so many people for the first time. She blushed slightly and said, I just feel sick. Why did you invite Mr. Li? Nonsense. Honey, you are a senior of the inborn realm. You are immune to diseases for a long time. If you suddenly feel sick, there must be a serious problem. Is it wrong for me to invite Mr. Li? Xian Jingzhou said with saliva spurting. Fang Yuan and others immediately left without a trace. Su Yu's face was redder, showing a little girl's style. In this life, she married the right person. After a long while, Su Li released her hand with a strange look. She put Su Yu's wrist in the quilt and turned around. It seemed that she was organizing her words. Fang Yuan, who had been paying attention to Su Li, saw that there was some irrepressible joy in her eyes. Could it be, Mr. Li, how is my wife? Is it a serious disease? Xian Jingzhou quickly asked with a serious face, this is not a place to talk. Why don't we go out and talk? Fang Yuan smiled slightly. Chu Qingning was puzzled and muttered in his heart, Su Li's aunt is sick, but this silly boy can still laugh. It doesn't matter. It's not a serious disease. Su Li comforted him and finally stopped Xian Jingzhou. She said, I will make a prescription later. Proprietress, remember to pay attention to rest and don't hurt the fetus. Xian Jingzhou didn't respond and nodded, thank you, Mr. Li. I will get the medicine right away. Su Yu, who was lying on the bed, was shocked and couldn't help but ask, Mr. Li, do you mean I? Su Li smiled brightly and nodded slightly, congratulations, proprietress. The little guy in your belly has been 2 months old. My wife is pregnant. Xian Jingzhou said in a daze and was suddenly dumbfounded. Chu Qingning and others were also shocked and immediately congratulated Su Li. Congratulations, Boss Xian. It's not easy for a senior of the inborn realm to give birth to a child. Congratulations. It's time to think of a name for the little guy. Everyone was chattering, and there was no lack of envy in Yin Xuedong's eyes. She secretly pinched Chu Qingning, which made Chu Qingning tremble secretly and feel wronged. He had worked hard enough, but it was difficult for a senior of the inborn realm to have a child. Xian Jingzhou and Su Yu had their first child at such an old age. However, Chu Qingning never dared to say this to Yin Xuedong. Xian Jingzhou was still standing stupidly, immersed in ecstasy. Until Su Yu's slightly shy call came into his ear, he suddenly came to himself. He knelt beside the bed, grabbed his wife's hand, and said excitedly, My wife, you are so great. No, I am so great, ah ha 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 ha. Seeing that Xian Jingzhou was excited like a child and completely lost his usual calmness, Su Yu was also very happy in her heart. She couldn't help but roll her eyes and said, Look at you. Hey, 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 Xian Jingzhou seemed to only know how to smirk. The news came so suddenly that he was not ready to be a father. Su Li looked at this scene and picked up the booklet with a faint smile on her lips. Only she and Su Yu were left in the Su family. It was a blessing to have the next generation. After writing the prescription, Su Li and others left one after another. They had no reason to continue to stay here. Zhouyue Winery was next to the Linli building. If there was any danger, they could also respond to it. Chapter 251. At this moment, Su Li, whom Su Yu missed, had returned to the affiliated school of the National Academy overnight. This time, Su Li disappeared for 1.5 days for no reason. Wu Bin was so anxious that he almost reported it to Dongfang Rui. Fortunately, Yun Yi and others knew the details of Su Li. They were smart enough to find a reasonable reason to stop Wu Bin. After all, Wu Bin believed that the guards of Yunwei could not betray Su Li and the Lord Rui's mansion, so he was very relieved. As for the reason, the only way to delay the time was to break through her cultivation. Wu Bin remembered that the Mrs. Cultivation was the acquired 8th hurdle. If she broke through, wouldn't she reach the acquired 9th hurdle? That was the last stage of the acquired hurdle. Thinking of this, Wu Bin was not anxious. Instead, he hoped that Su Li could practice in isolation for a few more days. After all, a short time meant that she could break through Shirbai. As soon as Su Li returned to her boudoir, Mammy Li immediately came in and said, Miss, you are finally back. Mammy Li told Su Li what Yun Yi told her. Su Li was slightly surprised and then nodded and chuckled. It was the right step to subdue the guards of Yunwei, which saved her a lot of trouble. Yun Yi, come in. Yun Yi, who was guarding outside the door, heard Su Li's voice and felt relieved. He opened the door and walked in. I am Yun Yi, miss. He was the only guard of Yunwei who knew all the details of Su Li. It was because he knew that it was impossible for the miss to be in danger in Yunjing City that he dared to lie about the military intelligence. Otherwise, He would be more anxious than anyone in the affiliated school of the National Academy. Seeing Yuni, Suli narrowed her eyes and nodded, "Thank you. Thanks to your adaptability this time. Take this bottle of elixir." Yuni held his head high, but there was a hint of hesitation on his face. Ms. Li was famous, so the elixir she took out was absolutely not bad. He hesitated not because of doubt, but whether he should take it or not. He just did what he should do. Suli couldn't help but laugh. She waved her hand and the bottle of elixir automatically flew into Yunyi's arms, which made Yunyi flustered for a while. He was afraid that the jade bottle would break. "Take it. You deserve it. There are 12 auxiliary elixirs for practice in it. They can speed up your practice. 9 of them are given to Yunir and the others. You keep the remaining 3. With the help, you can break through the inborn 5th hurdle in less than 3 months. From now on, you will come to me every 3 months to get the pills. Do you hear me?" Hearing this, Yunyi's eyes widened. He was overjoyed. He hid the jade bottle close to his body and immediately knelt down and kowtowed. "Thank you, miss, for bestowing me with the divine medicine." Not to mention their cloud pavilion, even in the entire martial arts world, there were very few pills that could assist the cultivation of the Xiantian realm and above. Most of them could only assist the cultivation of the Xiantian realm from the 1st stage to the 3rd stage. In the martial arts world, the early stage of the Xiantian realm was called the Xiantian realm, and the 4th stage of the Xiantian realm was called the middle stage of the Xiantian realm. So, it was simply unheard of to have an auxiliary pill that could help the breakthrough to the middle stage of the Xiantian realm. Young Miss is really talented to be able to research this level of medicinal pill. Soon, Yunyi's joy disappeared and turned into a dignified look. A man's wealth was his own ruin. The news that Miss had this kind of pill must not be leaked out. It seems that you've already thought of this, so I won't remind you any further. Cultivate well and don't let me down. Suli reminded him lightly, and Yunyi immediately bent over and kowtowed several times. "Yes, young miss. Well, you don't need to be too nervous. The 10 guards of the Yunj sect have passed my test. It's not a big problem for the news to be leaked." Suli waved her hand to let Yunyi relax. She said, "Go out and call Butler Wu by the way. If I don't show him something, he won't be so easily fooled." "Yes, Mississippi." Yunyi bowed and left. Soon, Wubin hurriedly stepped into the room. Seeing that Suli was intact, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Then he slightly opened his eyes in astonishment. The acquired 9th hurdle. Her breath was unstable. Miss really broke through. Yunyi didn't lie to him. He quickly reacted and quickly saluted, "Congratulations, Mississippi. You broke through the acquired 9th hurdle in just 1 day and night. Your talent is not inferior to that of the talents in the National Academy of Martial Arts." At the same time, he thought happily that he must tell the Lord as soon as possible. Although the identity of Princess Li was personally recognized by Lord Rui, it was inevitable that the juniors of the lords and the women in the palace gossiped with each other. A girl who was born in the vulgar countryside suddenly leaped over the branches and became a high and aloof Junju. The young ladies who were originally from noble families would naturally feel humiliated. In front of Prince Rui, they did not dare to speak carelessly, but in private, they might belittle the young lady. Occasionally, Wubin heard that a certain miss gathered together and said in private that the miss was the plaything of the lord and was very favored by the lord. So, she got the position of princess. Many people actually believed in such a preposterous statement and fought to spread it. It really angered him so much that he ascended to heaven and 2 Buddhas came into being. He couldn't eat for several days. He quickly sent more people to clear up the rumors. But the power of one person was limited. How could he stop the misses from all the noble families in Yunjing City? But now the mist broke through from the acquired 8th hurdle to the acquired 9th hurdle in less than half a year. It was completely different. The talent comparable to the martial arts genius of the National Academy was enough to prove Su Li's innocence. Even if she didn't rely on anyone, she would also shine. Butler, you flatter me. Su Li smiled indifferently and said, if you don't have anything to say, you can leave. I have to continue to consolidate my realm. Wu Bin nodded quickly and said, yes, yes. Miss, it's important for you to practice. I will leave first. Then Wu Bin didn't dare to delay. He quickly left the room and closed the door considerately. Su Li looked at him and sighed slightly. She was gratified. The past should not be admonished. It was her father's blessing to have such a loyal servant. In the blink of an eye, more than a month had passed. In the past month, Ling Li almost came to the affiliated school every day. Playboys and young talents from all over Yunjing City still came to make trouble. Most of them came to listen to Su Li's anecdotes. Every day, the affiliated school of the National Academy was crowded. It was more lively than the National Academy. Every night, Ling Li sneaked into the affiliated school of the National Academy like a cat that stole fish. He took Su Li away secretly and visited all the beautiful scenery in Yunjing City. He even didn't let go of the scenic spots and historical sites around Yunjing City. After the mental remembrance sacrifice, Su Li untied the knot in her heart. Every time she went out with Ling Li, she smiled more and more. Ling Li was naturally more happy. He couldn't wait to ask Chiu Meng to propose marriage immediately, but Su Li stopped him. The situation in the Ling mansion is chaotic. If I come, there will be more variables. When you succeed in your plan, I will wait for you. In the evening wind, the girl calmly narrated as if she could see the situation in Yunjing. At the end of her words, her cheeks turned red, just like the rosy clouds reflected by the setting sun. She looked beautiful instantly. Plop. 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 Looking at the touching appearance of his sweetheart, Ling Li's heart beat uncontrollably. He only saw Su Li's perfect side face. Few women in the world could be like her. For an uncertain ending, in order not to affect his plan, she was determined to wait for him. Ling Li murmured. Hierarch, who had always been indifferent to women, had a flash of slyness in his eyes. Suddenly, he buried himself in Su Li's chest and touched a ball of softness. Ling Li. Su Li was so angry and ashamed. Her cheeks immediately turned red. She stretched out her hands to push him away, but Ling Li was determined to stay. He held Su Li's hands domineeringly. His cultivation was a little higher than Su Li's. Even if they competed in strength, Su Li was no match for him. Moreover, Su Li couldn't hurt Ling Li cruelly. After a while, Su Li helplessly looked at Ling Li lying on her lap and squinting his eyes with enjoyment. Finally, she gave up resistance. She was no match for this rascal. Great Hierarch Ling's shamelessness, I've finally witnessed it today. You truly live up to your reputation. Hearing Su Li's teasing, Ling Li slightly raised his mouth. He turned sideways and held Su Li's waist with his hands. Smelling the fragrance from the girl, his tone was almost overflowing with love. My shamelessness only applies to my wife. If my wife is still not satisfied, then there's nothing I can do. Su Li's face suddenly turned red again. She snorted and said, Who is your wife? I haven't agreed yet. Ling Li immediately pretended to be shocked and said disappointedly, Honey, you just said you would wait for me. Why do you regret so soon? It really makes your husband's heart ache. Well, don't make trouble, Su Li gently knocked on Ling Li's forehead. Ling Li cried out in pain, but he calmed down. In fact, most of the time when he and Su Li were together, they were quiet. Only a few of them made trouble like children. But every time Ling Li made trouble, Ling Yimo couldn't help but leave. He was afraid that if he saw too much, the great and glorious image of Master in his heart would completely collapse. Master is much happier than before when he is with Miss Su Li. He no longer sighs and has nightmares. Should I also try to find a Ling Mo's indifferent expression hit a fiery heart. By the way, Ling Li. Is Ling Qinglan's real name Emo? Su Li suddenly asked. Ling Li was surprised. Finally, he nodded and said, yes. Ling Qinglan is an orphan of the Yi family. He is the eldest son. His real name is Emo. Later, he survived and was adopted by my second uncle's family. He changed his name to Ling Qinglan. How do you know it? Su Li smiled and said softly, I just asked a question for someone else. Ling Li suddenly thought of the young man in cyan. He frowned slightly and hesitated for a long time. But he couldn't help but ask in a low voice, what is the relationship between you and him? As a man, how could Ling Li allow his beloved to have another man beside her? If it was an ordinary man, it would be fine. But Mr. Li's talent and means were enough to threaten him. Between him and I, we are at most estranged partners. What are you worried about? Su Li chuckled and her eyes were clear. The answer she said made Ling Li calm down. It was almost the same as the answer given by Mr. Li. The relationship between Ling Li and Su Li was almost fixed. Now it was impossible for Mr. Li to intervene. Thinking of this, Ling Li smiled. Su Li couldn't help but smile. Chapter 252. In the past month, in addition to Su Li and Chu Lu, there was another person who lived a very comfortable life. That person was the former Xiangzhu of the Hehuan sect, Chu Lu. Leaning against the escalator on the third floor, Chu Lu looked at the bustling drinkers and waiters downstairs. Compared with the time when she just came, she was more relaxed and relieved and less worried. The Linli building didn't go back on their words. They didn't ask her to do anything in the past month. Just yesterday, Chu Qingning sent the antidote of the Hongshan powder. After a night of torment, the poison accumulated in her body for many years was eliminated. The effect was immediate and scary. Even if Mr. Li is very knowledgeable, it is impossible for him to expel the poison of nearly 10 years so quickly. The antidote used must be extraordinary. Chu Lu sighed and guessed. In this world, human life was the most worthless. Although she wanted to say that she was precious, she also knew that the value of the antidote used by Mr. Li was probably more than her own value. Such an important favor, but Mr. Li didn't mention it. I was worried that he would regret before. I was really a villain who gauged the heart of a gentleman. Chu Lu smiled bitterly. At this moment, Fong Ling came upstairs with a plate and said with a smile, "Sister Chu, what are you doing? It's time to drink the medicine." Chu Lu saw her and quickly took the hot medicine bowl. She smiled and said, "Thank you, Miss Fong Ling." The medicine was fierce and detoxified all the poison. Chu Lu was inevitably hurt. The medicine that Fong Ling brought was for her to recover. "You are welcome." Fong Ling smiled and shook her head. After Chu Lu drank the medicine soup, she took the medicine bowl and was about to go downstairs. But Chu Lu's voice came from behind. "Miss Fong Ling, please wait. Is there anything else, Sister Chu?" Fong Ling looked back with doubt. Chu Lu hesitated. Finally, she walked quickly to Fong Ling and asked in a low voice, "Miss Fong Ling, do you know what the antidote that Mr. Li gave me yesterday is made of?" Fong Ling looked strange and answered naturally, "Sister Chu, you baffled me." There are so many kinds of elixirs that Mr. Li refined, and the prescriptions are even more complicated. How can I know how to refine the antidote you took? Fong Ling's answer was within Chu Lu's expectation, but she was still disappointed. Fong Ling raised her eyebrows slightly. Thinking of her brother's instructions, a sly look flashed in her eyes. She deliberately lowered her voice and said, "Sister Chu, the prescription of the elixir is Sir's secret. It's wrong to inquire about it. However, I saw that when Mr. Li refined the antidote for my sister, my brother took something into it." Chu Lu's thoughts were immediately aroused. She couldn't help but ask, "What is it?" "Full moon and heartstrings." "What?" Fong Ling says it out loud. Chu Shi is so scared that she widens her eyes and almost has a cardiac arrest. "Mr. Li, the culprit of that bloody storm, let her eat it." "Oh, I didn't say complete. It's just a shell of the full moon and heartstrings." Fong Ling added with a smile, rolling her eyes, "I heard from my brother that Sir sacrificed a lot in order to peel off a layer of the outer shell to detoxify you." Hearing that, Chu Lu's heart was in turmoil. She was extremely complicated. She believed Fong Ling's words. Anyway, she stayed in the Hehuan sect for nearly a long time. If the full moon and heartstrings, such a miraculous thing, was destroyed, it would not be complete. Even if it was still effective, it would be limited. In order to fulfill his promise, Mr. Li gave up the way of the Zifu. Chu Lu's mind was overwhelmed by guilt almost instantly. She was stunned and didn't come to herself for a long time. Fong Ling saw that Chu Lu had such a big reaction and was slightly shocked. It seemed that she had said too much. "What are you doing?" A slightly helpless voice came. Fong Ling looked up and saw Su Li dressed in cyan clothes. She was not surprised. Since Su Yu was pregnant, Su Li ran to the Linli building more often. She was embarrassed and vomited. Then she turned and ran away. She said so much just because she felt guilty for Chu River's sake. Both she and her brother didn't have a good impression of Chu Shi. Although the relationship between Chu Lu and the Linli building was just a transaction, Chu Lu was too narrow-minded. Obviously, Sister Li had said it so clearly, but Chu Lu still doubted it. If she felt comfortable, it would be strange. Looking at Fong Ling going away, Su Li shook her head slightly. With Fong Ling's courage, she wouldn't say that. It was probably Fong Yuan's idea. "Chu Lu, come up and see me." Hearing Su Li's call, Chu Lu came to herself and went upstairs anxiously. She sat down beside the chair in front of the table. "You don't need to worry about what Fong Ling said. The full moon and heartstrings is not as serious as you think." Su Li's first sentence was to comfort her. But when she said that, Chu Lu's face was more guilty. Obviously, she misunderstood Su Li and said that to comfort her. Su Li was more helpless. She shook her head and took out a thin piece of paper from the drawer. It was full of small words. "Well, I have news about your brother. As for whether to recognize him or not, you decide." "Is there news about my brother?" Chu Lu trembled when she heard that. She couldn't care about anything else and took the paper carefully and eagerly. Ling Qinglan, 18 years old, was adopted by Ling Feng, the second son of the Ling family, after the extermination of the Yi family 14 years ago. He changed his name to Ling Qinglan. After that, he lived a carefree life for 10 years until Ling Feng died suddenly. Now he is the chief of the Supreme Judiciary and is in charge of the Supreme Judiciary. Since he took office, he has been investigating the clues of the outstanding cases on the pretext. Chu Lu didn't read much and her eyes were blurred. Tears dripped down her cheeks. When she saw that Ling Qinglan had been tracking down the murderer all these years, she couldn't help the sadness in her heart and burst into tears. Su Li looked indifferent and watched Chu Lu crying. She didn't stop her or say anything. She only heard the rhythmic tapping of her fingertips on the edge of the table. After an hour, the crying in the room gradually stopped. Chu Lu's eyes were swollen, but she couldn't hide the excitement in her eyes. She grasped the paper in her hand tightly and asked expectantly, "Mr. Li, can I go to see him now?" A smile appeared on Su Li's indifferent face. She nodded slightly and said meaningfully, "The murderer of the extermination of the Yi family is still at large. If you want to save Yi Mo's life, you'd better guard against others." Chu Lu's face changed immediately and she worried about the safety of her brother. She absent-mindedly said goodbye and left the attic. After 3 days, Chu Lu didn't go out. Fang Yuan, who knew the inside story, was surprised. On the 4th day, Chu Lu found Fang Yuan with a pale face and whispered, "Protector Fang, I want to see Mr. Li again." "I don't know." Fang Yuan was a little annoyed and said coldly, "Mr. Li has fulfilled his promise. It has nothing to do with you. You can't see him. If you can, please leave these days." Chu Lu was anxious immediately, but Fang Yuan shook his head and left directly. It was Su Li's order to let her leave. This woman's heart was in a mess. "Mr. Li will definitely help me." Chu Lu bit her lower lip and whispered. She clutched her chest with one hand and seemed to be out of breath. Living in the Linley building for more than a month, she was used to the discussion of Mr. Li, but she forgot that the careful care was all because of the deal. After a while, Su Li came back from the Zhouyue winery. She flew directly to the top floor and didn't appear in Chu Lu's eyes. Chu Lu, or Yi Shui. This woman was as smart as Ling Qinglan, but her experience made her have the heart of a weak person. She couldn't think independently like Ling Qinglan. In other words, Chu Lu had a sense of dependence on the Linley building and Su Li now. If she was not Mo's sister, it would be a good thing. Su Li let Chu Lu live in the Linley building to feel peaceful. She wanted to absorb Chu Lu into the Linley building and use her. But since she knew that Chu Lu's brother was Ling Qinglan, she immediately dispelled this idea. After all, Ling Qinglan was a member of the Yinmo cult. He was the only relative of Chu Lu. After they recognized each other, Chu Lu was likely to expose the Linley building to the Yinmo cult, which was unacceptable. Therefore, Chu Lu needed to be beaten. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. She wanted Chu Lu not to mention anything about the Linley building even if she went back to Ling Qinglan. Although this process might not be very good for Chu Lu. But, it had nothing to do with her. If it weren't for Ling Li, she might not let her recognize Ling Qinglan. The relationship between her and Chu Lu really didn't arouse her sympathy. Compared with the previous life, she was more humane in this life. There were many partners around her who worked hard with her. After 3 years, she just got rid of the most annoying Zhu Yan. She also untied the knot in her heart and got together with Ling Li again. But, all these didn't mean that the influence of the previous life on her was reduced. In her bones, Su Li was still the cold-blooded devil that ordinary people couldn't accept. She would do anything to achieve her goals. It was still cold in February. In the east courtyard of the Ling mansion, Ling Li leaned on the wheelchair and basked in the sun. He was more worried than before. These days, he didn't pay special attention to Su Li's whereabouts, but he noticed that Su Li disappeared for a period of time every few days. During this time, she never mentioned where she went. Ling Li couldn't help but think of the young man in Sian who always smiled. No, Li won't lie to me. Ling Li got rid of the distractions, but he felt bitter in his heart. He knew that he was too nervous about Su Li, so he felt worried about gains and losses. But knowing was one thing, and feeling was another. Master, you are not in a stable state of mind. Is there anything bothering you? Ling Xian's gentle voice sounded in his ears. Ling Li came to his sense and turned his head to see a pair of gentle eyes. He immediately moved away uncomfortably and changed the topic. Why didn't Xiaomo and Qinglan come today? Ling Xian looked at Ling Li, who turned his back. Her eyes were no longer gentle, but full of gloom. But her tone was still gentle. Ling Mo heard that there were clues, so he immediately went out of the city to investigate the Wanjian sect. Master Qinglan went to the Supreme Judiciary in a hurry. In a hurry. Ling Li's eyes flickered slightly. Is Su Qingtan going to come out of practice? Chapter 253. It's still early for the affiliated school of the National Academy to open. Master, take a rest before you set off. Ling Xian said. Ling Li was thinking about Su Qingtan. He nodded slightly and pushed the wheelchair back to the study. He was so absorbed in thinking that he didn't find that Ling Xian's eyes were shining. Master, don't bother yourself too much. I lit the incense for you. I'll go down now. Ling Xian rubbed the flint and lit the incense. She looked at the white smoke slowly drifting out. She smiled coldly and turned to leave the room. In less than a quarter, Ling Li leaned on the chair and fainted. It was hard to guard against a thief at home. Ling Li would never expect that Ling Xian, who had been loyal to him, would suddenly attack him with the knockout drug provided by the Linli building, knockout incense. The smell of knockout incense was exactly the same as that of ordinary incense. If one was not a master of poison, he couldn't distinguish it even if his cultivation was high. Squeak, the door was opened. Ling Xian came back. She put out the burning incense to ventilate and covered the blanket for Ling Li unhurriedly. She whispered, Master, have a good sleep. After you wake up, you won't have any worries. I will eradicate all obstacles for you. Then Ling Xian smiled and pointed at the place between Ling Li's eyebrows to smooth the wrinkles. Then she straightened her back and stopped smiling. She turned to leave the Ling house. Ling Li closed his eyes tightly. He felt something was wrong when he was in a coma. Unfortunately, the efficacy of knockout incense was so strong that he couldn't resist it. At the same time, Su Li received a secret letter from the killer of the Shuolo cult. She opened the secret letter and took out the paper. It was a map of Yunjing City. A red circle was circled not far from the Moyne Street. It's the same trick as last time. What does he want to show me? Su Li frowned and curled her lip slightly. After thinking for a while, she didn't want to delve into it. She got up and said to Mammy Li, I'll go out and come back before the school opens. Let Yuni keep an eye on me. Yes, Mississippi, Mammy Li responded, but she couldn't help but mutter in her heart, it's not enough to go out at night. Why do you want to have a rendezvous with the third master so early in the morning? The street in the early morning was very cold, and the affiliated school of the National Academy was even quieter. Su Yu, who had restored her true face, hid in the corner of the street. She looked at the heavily guarded affiliated school of the National Academy. She was hesitant, but she couldn't hide her excitement. She had decided to recognize Su Li. She really wanted Su Li to know that she had a nephew. But his identity was sensitive. How was he supposed to meet her? Su Yu pursed her lips and clasped her hands nervously in front of her chest. She came here almost every morning secretly. She didn't leave until the affiliated school of the National Academy was crowded. Forget it. I'd better ask Mr. Li for help. Su Yu muttered to herself and turned to leave. Mr. Li was neither a relative nor a friend of theirs, and he had helped them a lot. It was embarrassing for them. However, she finally understood that if she wanted to meet Su Li without exposing her whereabouts, she could only rely on Mr. Li's help. But at this moment, Siu caught a glimpse of a red shadow flashing from the back door of the National Academy and disappeared into the alley. That's Suli. Although it was just a back, Suyu, who missed Suli every day, recognized her at a glance. She was surprised. That speed is clearly above the inborn realm. Where is Suli going? Suyu didn't have time to think and immediately followed up. Although she was pregnant and her strength was affected, her body movement was not affected. She could still display the speed of the inborn ninth hurdle. Suli was thinking about Lingli, so she was very fast. She arrived at the place marked on the map in less than 15 minutes. It's just one corner. This place is so remote. What did Lingli arrange? Suli felt strange and finally realized that something was wrong. Even in the early morning, the surrounding streets were too quiet. No. Although the letter was sent by the Shuolo cult, there was nothing in the letter to prove that it was Ling Li's idea. Anyone could draw a circle on the map. It was not Ling Li. She was fooled. Suli realized it. The sense of crisis that had been suppressed was immediately magnified. Her eyelids kept twitching. Then she retreated without saying anything. But at this moment, an extremely horrible power shrouded her like a mountain. Go to hell. Suli groaned with blood spilling from the corner of her mouth. Her bones were creaking because of the pressure. She would be crushed into minced meat in the next moment. At the moment of crisis, Suli was very clear-headed. She bit the tip of her tongue. The severe pain stimulated her whole body. She immediately recovered her actions and got rid of the suppression. Boom! The bluestone tiles where Suli was were all crushed into powder. The stone chips were flying. There was a slight sound of surprise. It seemed that the person was surprised that Suli could escape a fatal blow. Suli didn't go to see the source of the sound. She turned around and fled. The person who attacked was definitely a senior in the longevity realm. She had no power to resist at all. She could only escape. I was careless. Who on earth wants to kill me? They even sent such a horrible person. Suli looked gloomy. Recently, she was with Lingli, so her vigilance was too low. If it was in the past, she would not find such a trap until it was close. The person who sent the Shuolo cult must be related to the Yinmo cult. Is it the third elder? Suli thought quickly. She didn't slow down and escaped to the downtown area in the blink of an eye. Even if the person who chased after her was powerful, he would not dare to attack her in public. Otherwise, the Dongfang family would investigate thoroughly for the sake of their reputation. He. Little mouse, you run so fast. A cold voice suddenly sounded. Suli's face changed dramatically because the voice didn't come from behind, but from the front. She was about to turn around immediately, but the person who attacked her moved faster. A palm print as big as a cattail leaf fan attacked her fiercely. In a hurry, Suli only had time to adjust her body to avoid the fatal point. Boom! Suli flew out like a rag. She smashed several brick walls and fell into a dilapidated courtyard. Then she stopped. In dizziness, Suli shook her head fiercely. She was about to get up. But at this moment, a person came out from behind and kicked her in the back. Puff! Suli's internal organs were shaken. She couldn't help but cough up blood. The blood was sprinkled on the weeds. The color was extremely bright. Her pupils shrank. She wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth. Just one blow damaged her internal organs. She was seriously injured and almost died. Was this the longevity realm? You can still keep so calm in the face of death. You do have some skills. No wonder the young master will be fascinated by you and fall in love with you. An elegant voice came from behind. Su Li's eyes flashed a ray of light. She slowly sat up and turned her eyes. Her voice was still calm. Ling Xian, I should have known it was you. I thought your loyalty was greater than jealousy. Now it seems I overestimated you. Ling Xian's eyes were cold. Everything I did was for the young master. Don't talk nonsense. At this time, there were footsteps behind her. A strange elder came into Su Li's eyes. Holy girl, I need an explanation. The elder stared at Ling Xian with a cold face. Your Excellency, did you secretly summon me for your selfishness? Ling Xian stared at Su Li and wanted to strangle her immediately. But Su Li was lucky and gave her a chance to speak. If she couldn't get the elder's trust, she would be in a very bad situation. Thinking of this, she saluted respectfully. Elder, how dare I deceive you? This woman is scheming and extremely cunning. Even the hierarch was fascinated by her and lost the full moon and heartstrings. I made this plan just to wake the young master up. Even if the young master hates me in the future, I will never complain. The elder's expression was slightly relaxed. It was not that he didn't believe Ling Xian, but Ling Xian concealed something from him, so he was dissatisfied. Your Excellency, I certainly know your loyalty to the hierarch. Ling Xian was calm. But at this time, Su Li suddenly said, May I ask what is your position in the emo cult? How is it compared with the third elder? If you can invite the third elder, I have a way to prove that she is not the evil woman that Ling Xian said. If what Ling Xian said is false, you will regret for a lifetime if you make a wrong move. The elder frowned. What Su Li said was reasonable. The third elder was in the headquarters of the emo cult. It was very convenient to invite him. The hierarch was young and easily deceived, but the third elder would not be deceived in a short time, right? When Ling Xian heard Su Li's words, she was very anxious, but she didn't dare to show it on the surface. An idea flashed in her mind, and she immediately pretended to be extremely anxious. Elder, do it quickly. She is stalling for time. This woman's destiny is too strong. She is not dead after being hit by you 2 times in a row. If the time is too long, the force behind this woman may be on the way. Su Li's eyes flashed, and she was about to call out the mask. But she thought that Ling Li didn't wear his secret method in this life. If the mask was found out from his body, wouldn't it directly prove that she stole the secret method of the emo cult? Elder, it's too late. You have seen me grow up. How can you trust outsiders? Kill her quickly, and let's go. Ling Xian's eyes were full of tears, and she cried. The fourth elder's heart suddenly softened. Without saying anything, he patted the head of Su Li who couldn't move. Su Li smiled bitterly and closed her eyes. Ling Xian grinned, and her eyes were red. She showed a successful smile. She wanted to see Su Li being patted into pieces. Bang! A miserable groan sounded in Su Li's ears. She opened her eyes blankly, and saw that the old man was also stunned. His hands were full of blood, and he stared at her back. Who helped me to block the blow? Su Li's face was pale. She covered her chest and tried to look back. She couldn't see the face of the dying person lying in the pool of blood. But when she saw the blood flowing from the lower body, she suddenly felt a sharp pain from the bottom of her heart, which became more and more intense. No, how could she be here? Su Li's eyes were full of panic, and her lips were trembling. She completely forgot the crisis behind her, and she didn't know where she got the strength to climb to the pool of blood. When she was close, a familiar face came into her eyes. Su Li stiffly and gently held her upper body in her arms. She lowered her head, and tears finally came out. Chapter 254. Clatter, the sky was gloomy, and it suddenly rained, drowning Su Li's cry. When Su Yu heard the word "aunt," her consciousness that was about to go away seemed to be pulled back by her obsession. She opened her eyes reluctantly and saw the tears on Su Li's face. They mixed with rainwater and dripped down her chin. She suddenly grasped Su Li's hand and moved her lips. "Li, how do you know?" Su Li trembled all over. She suddenly raised her head and saw Su Yu's half-opened eyes. Hope rose in her heart. She condensed a stream of green starlight and poured it into Su Yu's body. But she forgot that she was also seriously injured. Blood immediately rushed up her throat. She reluctantly swallowed a mouthful of heart blood. With a strange flush on her face, she hurriedly said, "Aunt, I know. I have always known it. I am timid. I didn't dare to recognize you at the first time. You must be safe. I will take you away now." When the green starlight entered her body, Su Yu breathed heavily. When she had a little strength in her body, she immediately stopped Su Li from transmitting the green starlight. She stared at Su Li with gentle eyes, as if she wanted to remember this face forever. "Ahem. Silly girl, run away." "No. Aunt, you will be fine." While talking, Ling Xian and the elder approached. The rain fell around them, but was bounced off by an invisible force. It was still clean. However, Su Li was covered with mud at this moment. Su Li clenched her teeth and held Su Yu. Her broken body couldn't bear the heavy punishment. She groaned, and blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. But it was quickly washed away by the cold rain. She seemed to see nothing and just wanted to hold Su Yu and leave. But Ling Xian wouldn't let Su Li get what she wanted. She looked at Su Li playfully. Su Li picked up Su Yu from the mud and stood up straight. Then she kicked Su Li and Su Yu away immediately. Their blood splashed in the sky. They hit the wall and fell bricks and stones. If there was no accident, both of them should be dead. The elder frowned and reminded her, "Holy girl, this trip is against the harmony of nature. Just kill them. There is no need to torture them." Ling Xian lowered her head and obediently admitted her mistake. "I was rude." The old man looked relaxed and nodded slightly, but he did not see the joy in Ling Xian's eyes. If Su Li didn't die in pain, how could she vent the hatred she had accumulated in the past few months? "It's getting late. After I take the demoness head, I'll return to see the sect master." The old man walked toward the broken wall and said, "According to what you said, as long as this woman dies, the demonic spell will naturally be undone. After the cult master wakes up, he will surely understand the Holy Virgin's painstaking efforts." Ling Xian's eyes lit up. She nodded and smiled. "You are right." Boom! The elder flicked his sleeves and raised a gust of wind, which lifted all the scattered bricks and stones. The situation made the elder slightly moved. When the two people were kicked away by Ling Xian, it was Su Li who was holding Su Yu, but now it was reversed. Su Yu had lost her breath, but she still stood in front of Su Li and used her last strength to keep Su Li alive. Such a sentimental person, was it really as the holy maiden said, a demoness? He was suspicious, and his palm fell on the head of Su Li, who was in a coma, for a long time. Ling Xian walked closer and saw this scene. Her face immediately became gloomy. Su Li was still alive. "Elder, now is not the time to be soft-hearted. Since you don't want to do it, let me do it myself." Ling Xian stepped forward and slammed her palm without hesitation. The old man's pupils contracted. At this moment, he finally felt that he was cheated. But at this moment, the third elder's anxious voice came from afar, "Fourth elder, stop Ling Xian." "What?" The old man stood in front of Su Li and immediately stopped Ling Xian. Bang! Ling Xian was shocked by the counterforce, and her pretty face turned pale. She stepped back several steps and looked extremely gloomy. Fourth Elder, you are so indecisive. You will only ruin the great plan of the hierarch. The old man snorted. I now suspect that the Holy Virgin has evil intentions. Please don't act rashly. Wait for the third elder to come and decide. Ling Xian looked gloomy. She stared at Su Li's pale face. Suddenly, she thought of something and smiled calmly again. Such an injury had hurt her foundation. Even if Su Li escaped tonight, she would only become a useless person and couldn't live for more than 10 days. There was no need for her to be anxious. In the blink of an eye, the figure of the third elder was close. He was so anxious that he even forgot to separate the rain. The fourth elder was shocked, and his attention was subconsciously attracted by the third elder. This distraction suddenly made a flaw appear behind him. Suddenly, a flash of sword light appeared and stabbed the back of the fourth elder with great momentum. Watch out, fourth elder. Such an unexpected change made it too late for the third elder to rescue him. He could only shout. Puff! In the eyes of Ling Xian, a huge wound of more than 10 feet appeared on the back of the fourth elder. He flew out directly and fell to the ground. A man in black with a bamboo hat appeared in front of Su Li out of thin air. Junior sister apprentice. Su Yu's body was already cold. The eyes of the man in black were full of grief and indignation, but he still had a little sense. He put the healing elixir into the mouth of Su Li, who was still alive, and then stood up. His eyes were full of killing intent. He was Wen Tingshan, who just arrived in Yunjing City today and heard the noise. You all deserve to die. Third elder, help me. Ling Xian screamed. The third elder hurriedly settled the fourth elder. He was full of anger but had no time to vent. He had to fight with Wen Tingshan. For a time, the rain was flying, and the shock wave smashed everything around into powder. Su Li and Ling Xian were blown out and fell directly on the bluestone street. The rain was pouring, and there was no pedestrian on the street. Ling Xian glanced at the two people who were fighting in the distance, and then saw Su Li, who was still in a coma. The fear in her eyes was immediately replaced by madness. Without any nonsense, she directly slapped Su Li's glabella. Stop! Stop! When Tingshan and the third elder saw this scene at the same time, and their expressions changed greatly. They shouted loudly, but Ling Xian turned a deaf ear to them. She didn't stop at all, and the smile on her face widened crazily. Su Li. At the moment when the palm was about to hit Su Li's face, Su Li suddenly opened her eyes. Her eyes were full of coldness and brutality. Ling Xian's scalp was numb, and immediately slapped her palm faster. Crack! The slender palm covered with mud pinched Ling Xian's wrist. The wound on it had turned white, and no blood flowed out. You still have strength. Ling Xian was stunned. She struggled hard, but felt that the strength was increasing rapidly. Then she heard a crisp sound. Crack! Ah! Su Li loosened her hand and stood up slowly. Ling Xian held her arm and retreated in horror. She shouted in panic, Third elder, help! The third elder frowned slightly and was about to step forward to stop her. But there was a long whistle behind him. Sword lights attacked him desperately, and he couldn't get away. Seeing this scene, Ling Xian was completely panicked. She stepped back for a few steps. She suddenly thought of something and said fiercely, Su Li, you can't kill me. If I die, the master will definitely not let you go. Su Li was expressionless and slightly stopped. Ling Xian was slightly happy and said, Su Li, if you still have some sense, let me go. I will explain it clearly in front of the master and accept my punishment. Anyway, as long as she successfully went back alive and exhausted Su Li to death, her plan would be successful. She would definitely be punished, but it didn't matter. As long as it was a long time, it was enough to erase everything. The master would finally choose her. It could only be her. It's ridiculous. Are you still dreaming at this time? Su Li's voice was hoarse like a ghost. She turned into a shadow and pinched Ling Xian's neck. Ling Xian was so scared that her face turned pale. Li, stop. Ling Li appeared at the corner of the street. He was wet all over, and his cold face was full of anxiety. The first scene he saw was that Su Li killed Ling Xian. He subconsciously stopped her. The voice was so familiar that it was almost engraved in his soul. Su Li's body trembled violently. Her pale face flashed a look of mockery. She pinched Ling Xian's throat with one hand. Crack! The crisp sound came to everyone's ears. The light in Ling Xian's eyes gradually disappeared, and she fell at Su Li's feet. God didn't let her go after all. Xian. Ling Li was still in red. He flashed like a gust of wind from behind Su Li and held Ling Xian, who fell to the ground. He forcibly passed some genuine energy to Ling Xian and saved her last breath. Haha, Ling Xian struggled to open her eyes. When she saw Ling Li's eyes full of anger and sadness, she immediately showed a sweet smile. It turns out that the master still cares about me. Xian. I'm so happy. Ahem. Blood constantly gushed from her throat and soaked Ling Li's chest. Ling Li immediately wanted to pass more genuine energy to Ling Xian, but was stopped by Ling Xian. She trembled and wanted to wipe the tears from Ling Li's eyes. It's useless. Xian can't accompany the master. Xian, crack. Ling Xian's arm hung down. The third elder and Wen Tingshan had stopped fighting. The third elder looked complicated, while the third elder was expressionless. There was some comfort in his eyes. Ling Li slowly raised his head and stared at Su Li's pale face. His eyes were painful and sad. He said slowly, Why? Why did you kill Xian? No matter what she did wrong, she didn't deserve to die. You clearly knew. He had been with Ling Xian for 10 years. He had always regarded Ling Xian as his sister. But now the woman he loved most killed his sister. Drip, drip, the rain gradually subsided. A drop of water fell on the ground along Su Li's clothes. It was quiet and harsh. Ling Li stared at Su Li's eyes interrogatively. But today, he could no longer see a trace of warmth in her eyes. There was only coldness, tyranny, and disappointment. Ling Li was shocked. He had no time to understand what happened. Su Li's expressionless face bloomed with a smile. The smile was obviously brilliant. But in Ling Li's eyes, it was like a withered flower, leaving only sadness. Chapter 255. The fate was over. Ling Li suddenly raised his head and looked at the beautiful figure in red. He was stiff, as if he was struck by lightning. He couldn't believe it. Why did everything change in just one morning? What did Ling Xian do? Ling Li groaned in pain, but he was interrupted as soon as he spoke. Uncle Shan, let's go. Su Li whispered. Wen Tingshan's eyes flashed with sadness. He turned around and walked to the collapsed wall. He gently held Su Yu, who was already cold. Madam, wait a minute. This is all a misunderstanding. Ling Xian did it willfully. Neither I nor the fourth elder knew about it. You. Seeing that Suli was about to leave, the third elder swallowed the second half of his words. Suli looked back for a moment, and her cold eyes fell on him like a ghost. The third elder had goosebumps all over his body. He was so scared that he could no longer continue to speak. He was in the longevity realm, and Madame was just at the peak of the inborn realm. Why, corpse? Why is there a corpse? When Ling Li saw the middle-aged woman in Wen Tingshan's arms, he finally realized something. His face was extremely pale. This person must be close to Suli. Ling Xian killed her. No wonder Suli was furious. The third elder looked at Ling Li's back and sighed sadly. He said, "Hierarch, I'm afraid that the truth is more serious than you think. It was too late when I arrived. Only the fourth elder knows the details." Ling Li's body shook slightly, but he didn't look back. He slowly bent down and picked up Ling Xian. After a moment of silence, his hoarse voice came out. "Go back to the headquarters." Ling Li and the other three returned to the headquarters of the Spectre's Shadow. One was dead and the other was injured. It naturally caused a great shock. All kinds of speculations came one after another. At this moment, in the backyard, the fourth elder came to the courtyard with a pale face with the help of the third elder. He saw Ling Li standing next to the coffin at a glance. The third elder sighed and shook his head slightly. He supported the fourth elder to walk over. The fourth elder already knew everything at this moment. He regretted it very much. When he saw Ling Li, he immediately burst into tears. He knelt down and cried, "Hierarch, please punish me to death. I listened to Ling Xian's slander and made a big mistake." Ling Li turned around. He was expressionless and pale. "What happened? Say it." "When I was doing closed-door training in the Mountain of Elders, I suddenly received a secret letter from Ling Xian, saying that you were bewitched by the demoness," the fourth elder said. Ling Li's face became paler and paler. In the end, he was shaky and couldn't stand stably. "Sect leader, your health is important." The third elder felt extremely distressed when he saw this. The hierarch's innate talent was unparalleled, and he was already half a step into the longevity realm. But now, because of a few words, he couldn't stand still. One could imagine how great the blow was. Phew! Taking a deep breath, Ling Li suddenly turned around and smashed the coffin into pieces in the horrified eyes of the two elders. "Ling Xian, you are very good. Even if you die, you will let Li leave me completely." Ling Xian's eyes were red. Looking at Ling Xian's exposed face, she gnashed her teeth. What the fourth elder said was very detailed. When he heard that Ling Xian abused and killed Suli, he couldn't wait to pull Ling Xian out of the coffin and kill her again. No matter how deep the affection was, when he wanted to kill Suli with his own hands, it had already disappeared. Hierarch, the identity of the middle-aged woman is not simple. The fourth elder felt bitter, but he had to say something. "I heard that Madame called her aunt, and the woman's lower body was bleeding seriously. It is very likely that she is pregnant." "What?" The third elder widened his eyes and said in horror, "Why didn't you say it earlier?" He thought that his discovery was serious enough, but he didn't expect that the fourth elder hid such a big secret. "Ha ha ha ha. The fate is over." "It turns out that the fate is over," that Li said. "Ha ha 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 ha." Ling Li's face was pale, and he laughed wildly. No matter how much he hated Ling Xian was dead. She was a member of the Yinmo cult, and he was the hierarch of the Yinmo cult. She killed her relatives. How could Suli marry the hierarch of the Yinmo cult? Puff! Ling Li was so sad that he spat out a few mouthfuls of blood and fell unconscious. "Hierarch!" the third elder exclaimed, and the whole backyard was immediately in chaos. After a while, the third elder looked at Lingli, who was lying on the bed with a pale face. He had a complicated expression and struggled for a while. Finally, he didn't dare to say what he saw. Madam of the Hierarch might not live for 10 days. In the blink of an eye, 3 days passed. For Suli, there was only endless darkness in these 3 days. She turned the street with one breath and fainted directly. In the morning, the slightly dazzling sunshine shone on her face. Suli's eyelashes trembled, and she finally woke up. Wake up! Wake up! Finally, you wake up. Ling, go and call everyone. A familiar voice came to her ears, and her eyes were also blurred. Suli frowned and adapted to it for a moment. Finally, she saw the figure beside the bed. Ruhan. Suli was confused. It was Mei Ruhan sitting beside the bed. Wasn't she in Qinghe province? Why did she come to Yunjing City? It's me, Li. When Mei Ruhan heard Suli's hoarse voice, she couldn't help crying. At this moment, Suli was not as brilliant as she used to be. Her face was terribly pale, just like a dead person, which made Mei Ruhan tremble. It's good that you are here. Suli smiled and didn't ask the reason, because it was meaningless. She was proficient in the medical circle. How could she know that her foundation was destroyed and she didn't have many days to live? Thud. Thud. Soon, there was a messy sound of footsteps behind her. Suli turned her head reluctantly. It was Xian Jingzhou who walked in the front. But at this moment, Xian Jingzhou's temples were gray, his eyes were red, and there were many wrinkles on both sides of his eyes, which made him look much older, like an old man in his twilight years. Uncle, Suli's eyes were sad and blurred. She murmured and her pale lips immediately overflowed with blood. Now she was like a fragile porcelain full of cracks. Any fluctuation of her heart meridian might directly kill her. Li. Xian Jingzhou was shocked. He strode to the edge of the bed and said, "People in Jianghu will get their shoes wet. Don't worry about your aunt. The most important thing for you now is to recover." No matter how sorrowful he was, the man chose to comfort Suli. Suli looked at Xian Jingzhou in a daze and suddenly smiled. "I know, uncle. You must be tired these days. Go and have a rest first." "I'm not tired." An ugly smile appeared on Xian Jingzhou's old face. "I have to take care of your aunt's funeral affairs. I don't have time to rest. As for you, it's better to put aside the matter of the Linli building and recover first." Xian Jingzhou left soon. Suli could see that he was holding on. She didn't know whether he could hold on after her death. There were 6 people left in the room. Seeing Mei Ruhan and Fong Ling, whose eyes were red and swollen, Suli couldn't help but chuckle. "Ruhan, Ling, you two go out first. I have something to tell you. Don't be tired." Mei Ruhan stood up and reminded them. Then she went out of the attic with Fong Ling. At this moment, a cold female voice suddenly sounded in her mind. "Tired? Mei Ruhan, your good friend can live for 6 days at most. It doesn't matter whether she is tired or not." "What did you say?" Mei Ruhan trembled all over. Fong Ling looked at her confusedly. What happened to Sister Ruhan? At the same time, the atmosphere in the room was solemn. Suli sat up reluctantly and leaned against the pillow. After a moment of silence, she whispered, "You should know that I don't have much time." As soon as the words came out, the 4 people in the room held their breath at the same time. Creak. Fong Yuan clenched his fists and stepped forward. The anxiety in his eyes almost broke through the limit. "What panacea do you need?" "I'll go now." "I'll go too." Chu Qingning's eyes were red. "Suli, I want to go back to Nanjiang with you." Don't die. Miss Su saved my life. If you need anything at this moment, Fong Mu, will do anything. I owe you a life. If you die, who can I find to pay the debt? Luo Chen stared at Su Li and hoped that she could say something to save his life. But Su Li smiled and shook her head in everyone's expectant eyes. How could it be? Fong Yuan looked at the porcelain-like cheeks in front of him. The regret and despair in his heart broke out like a landslide and a tsunami. It's all Ling Li's fault. I'll kill him. Fong Yuan turned around and left. Chu Qingning and others wanted to stop him, but they were thrown away by him. His strength was so great that it was amazing. Even Luo Chen was surprised. He hadn't seen Fong Yuan for a year. Fong Yuan's strength had made such great progress that he was not inferior to Luo Chen. Su Li's expression became cold and she said faintly, "If you want me to die with everlasting regret, go ahead." Fong Yuan's body shook violently. It seemed that his feet were splashed with glue. He could no longer move. He turned back and was full of resentment and complexity. He growled, "Why? Why do you still protect him at this time? Didn't he hurt you enough?" Looking at Fong Yuan's questioning eyes, Su Li closed her eyes and hid the disappointment in her eyes. She said softly, "I have killed the culprit. There is no need to entangle with the Yinmo cult. I don't have much time. You should listen to the next arrangement. As long as it develops according to what I said, the Linli building will become a big cult and realize your wishes." Fong Yuan's eyes twitched. He was angry and anxious. He said bitterly, "Are you still thinking about that at this time? Otherwise, even if I die, I must fulfill the agreement." Su Li smiled. That smile seemed to be beyond the mortal world. It was a beautiful withering. Chu Qingning and others were moved and shocked. Fong Yuan's reaction was more violent. He made up his mind and held Su Li in his arms. Chu Qingning was stunned at first. Then he smiled bitterly for his friend. Wasn't it too late for this fool to express his love now? Luo Chen couldn't bear it and turned his head. After he was moved, he couldn't bear to see such a scene. Chapter 256. Fong Yuan held Su Li for a while and felt the slight resistance in his arms. He took a deep breath and gently let go of Su Li for fear of aggravating her injury. "I'll be back soon." Fong Yuan took a deep look at Su Li and then strode away. Although his heart was full of despair, he had to try his best. "Let's go." The other three people also left, leaving Su Li to recuperate alone. Only in the state of not consuming strength could Su Li's life be extended to the greatest extent. Su Li looked at the backs of the people who left. Various emotions flashed through her eyes, including hatred, regret and sadness. Finally, it became extremely complicated. She closed her eyes. The helpless sigh quietly echoed in the room. In the evening, Yun-Yi came and soon left with a face of self-blame and heaviness. But it was impossible to make up for it. The only thing he could do was to try his best to complete the last order of the miss. At dinner, Fong Ling, Mei Ruhan and Yin Shuadong sat at the same table. The dishes on the table were full of color and smell, but no one touched the chopsticks. They were all in a daze. They had no appetite. Thinking of Su Li, the three people looked gloomy and didn't have the mood to eat. Mei Ruhan looked at the white rice in the bowl, and there was a hint of struggle in her eyes. About half a year ago, when she was checking the account, her wrist was accidentally pricked. From that day on, there often appeared a trace of unimaginable scenes in her dreams. But the familiarity from the soul made her involuntarily believe that the things in her dreams were true. If it was just a dream and didn't affect her daily life, it would be fine. But after this situation lasted for 3 months, something inexplicable happened to her. Another voice appeared in her mind out of nowhere. Who are you? Giggle. I am you, and you are me. There is no difference between you and me. The seductive and absolutely cold and arrogant tone was actually another her. She couldn't understand. The other her didn't seem to care about her feelings. She only told her that she must go to Yunjing City as soon as possible to be with Su Li, otherwise, she would occupy this body and kill Luo Chen personally. Mei Ruhan didn't believe it at first. But the next day, her consciousness was completely suppressed. She helplessly watched Su Li seduce Luo Chen and do that shameful thing with him. Although at the last moment of breakthrough, Su Li gave control of the body to her, she still felt humiliated. At the same time, she was also afraid. She understood Luo Chen's feelings for her, so he would not guard against her at all. If this person really occupied her body again to kill Luo Chen, she could not stop him at all. Don't worry. I just want you to be with Su Li. I won't hurt her. Every time I occupy your body, I will also suffer a great backlash, and I might even completely dissipate. How can I let myself fall into danger? Mei Ruhan couldn't tell whether it was true or not. But for Luo Chen, she cleverly used Wen Tingshan to come to Yunjing City with him. On the way, the voice in her mind also hid and stopped communicating with her. As time passed, she let go of the fear in her heart and turned it into anticipation. After a while, Li left Ling's hand. But she didn't expect that when Tingshan's expression changed greatly as soon as he entered Yunjing City. He rushed away and soon brought back Su Li, who was dying. Mei Ruhan was really scared. She almost stayed by Su Li's bed for 3 days. When Su Li woke up, she naively thought that Su Li was fine. Unexpectedly, the voice in her mind told her that Su Li was going to die. Of course, she didn't believe it. She eavesdropped outside the room. Soon, the senior management of the Linli building knew that Su Li was going to die. For Mei Ruhan, it was like a bolt from the blue. From the first time they met in the Muyang girls' school, she felt that Su Li was very congenial. After a few months, she knew how amazing Su Li's talent was. She just stayed with Su Li for a short time, but her understanding of literature soared. Later, Su Li took her to the Qinghe girls' school, which had a promising future. Then she established the Linli building. She knew that the world was so colorful. For her, Su Li was not only a good friend but also a teacher. She also wanted to see Su Li reach the Lingtian realm step by step and become a giant who controlled the martial arts circle. But the bad news came before she reached the halfway point. How could she accept it? Li is only 17 years old. How can she die? Mei Ruhan was full of unwillingness. If you don't want her to die, I have a way. The seductive voice came slowly in her mind. Mei Ruhan was shocked and couldn't help but ask, really? The seductive consciousness snorted and mocked, why should I lie to you? It's just that this method is not perfect. Your good friend may not accept it. Mei Ruhan frowned slightly, but the seductive consciousness was not anxious and let her hesitate. At this time, Mei Ruhan didn't find that her characteristics in some aspects were far beyond that of an 18-year-old girl. She also encountered a lot of events in Jianghu in the Linli building, but after all, she didn't participate in it personally. It could be said that Mei Ruhan had no experience in Jianghu at all. But facing a strange consciousness in her mind, she naturally chose to be vigilant. She even calmly confronted it and thought about the stakes. It was like an innate ability. In the blink of an eye, the dishes on the table were cold. Yin Shuadong cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks, and Fong Ling turned to boil medicine for Su Li. They were all tonics, but better than nothing. Mei Ruhan slightly raised her eyebrows and looked at the back of Yin Xuedong and Fong Ling. Her eyes gradually became firm. You tell Su Li in person, and let her judge whether your method is credible or not. Mei Ruhan's decision was extremely witty. Her knowledge and cultivation were too much lower than Su Li's. If she listened to the words of the seductive consciousness, she might not know whether it was true or not. In this case, it was better to let Su Li see it in person. Mei Ruhan's consciousness came out, and the seductive voice sounded again in her mind, but this time it was a little angry. Impossible. You know that I will have a backlash if I occupy your body. She doesn't deserve me to show up in person. You don't deserve me. Or you don't dare. Mei Ruhan gritted her teeth and responded, you threatened me to come to Su Li, obviously, you have a relationship with Su Li, don't treat me as a fool. You. The seductive consciousness made a sound of anger, and then calmed down. She regained her composure and said with a smile, good girl, you see it. In this case, I won't hide it. Su Li does have a relationship with me. In this case, I will risk the backlash, to help her. Then let's go now. Mei Ruhan breathed a sigh of relief and immediately went upstairs without any delay. Squeak, the sound of the door being pushed came into Su Li's ears, and she immediately woke up. She was on the verge of death, so how could she fall asleep? At this moment, she just closed her eyes to rest. Seeing it was Mei Ruhan, Su Li looked gentle and pretended to be relaxed. It's so late. Why don't you go to rest? What are you doing here? I know. Mei Ruhan said, and her eyes turned red. Su Li was stunned, and her smile was more bitter, but her voice was still gentle. Life and death are predestined. If you have time to be sad now, why don't you chat with me more? Then I can leave happily. I don't want to. Mei Ruhan shook her head again and again. Suddenly, she stepped forward and grabbed Su Li's pale and slender hand. She whispered, Li, someone said that she has a way to help you. I don't believe her, so I can only let you judge the way she said. Su Li's eyes burst with amazing light when she heard this. If she could not die, who would want to die? What's more, she still had many things to do. How could she be willing to die like this? But even if she was unwilling, she could only despair and accept her fate in the face of a broken life. But now, Mei Ruhan actually said that there was a way. Who is she? Su Li asked, and the breath of Mei Ruhan in front of her instantly changed. The original pure eyes became strange and horrifying. The incompatible breath could not be tolerated by the world. This change was too bizarre. Even Su Li, who was calm, was stunned on the spot. Mei Ruhan seemed to be a different person. One person with two consciousnesses. How could it be possible? At this moment, Mei Ruhan saw Su Li's surprised face and smiled mysteriously. Senior sister apprentice, I haven't seen you for a long time. You, call me senior sister apprentice. Su Li quickly calmed down and slightly frowned. Who are you? Senior sister apprentice, don't be surprised. I am Mei Ruhan, and Mei Ruhan is me. As for why I call you senior sister apprentice, it is naturally because I admire you very much. When we first met, I couldn't help calling you senior sister apprentice. Hearing the explanation of Mei Ruhan, Su Li's heart was full of doubts. Her explanation was obviously a lie. But if she went deeper, she might not get the answer. What is the life-saving method you mentioned? Su Li didn't have too much time and directly came to the point. Mei Ruhan giggled and said, Senior sister apprentice, you are really impatient. But I can understand. Next, I will tell you the method. Please stimulate the Naguan acupoint of your left hand. It's better to use a sharp object to stab it 1 inch down. Suli frowned and reached out to take a silver needle from the needle box beside the bed. Then she stabbed it into the Naguan acupoint. The Naguan acupoint was not a fatal acupoint. For ordinary people, it could cure diseases. But for warriors, it was a completely useless acupoint. So, she did not hesitate to implement what Mei Ruhan said. But this time, Suli was destined to be surprised. Soon after the silver needle was stabbed, a pale red halo suddenly appeared out of thin air like a bracelet. It was engraved with complex patterns, revealing a mysterious and ancient atmosphere. What is this? Suli was slightly surprised. How could such a thing be hidden in a person's Naguan acupoint? This was completely against common sense. It was not mentioned in any medical books in the martial arts circle and the spiritual circle. Suddenly, Suli's eyes flashed. She remembered the mysterious old beggar she met on the street a long time ago. He avoided her left hand and left a black pattern on her right hand. That old man also knew the secret. Chapter 257. Buzz, the red ring buzzed slightly and dimmed down. Suli looked at the wrist that was disappearing, and various thoughts flashed through her eyes. At this time, Mei Ruhan took the initiative to explain, this ring is of extraordinary significance. Not everyone has it. Only those who are born with extraordinary fate are qualified to have it. Senior Sister Apprentice, if you want to live, you have to rely on this ring. How? Suli asked indifferently with no expression on her face. There is no other way. Just break it. Mei Ruhan's eyes flashed and she said, I have heard that there is another name for this ring, which is life ring. It is not related to the present life, but the previous life and the future life. Suli was slightly shocked, but she showed doubt on her face. She mocked, you even mentioned the previous life and the present life. It is really outrageous. Mei Ruhan smiled mysteriously and continued, don't doubt me. Even the existence like me can appear, why can't the previous life and the present life? Your life ring is red jade, which proves that you have a very high foundation in the previous life. If you die now, the foundation of the previous life and the present life will be accumulated again to the next life. If you choose to break the ring, you can not only get the foundation of the previous life, but also the vitality of the next life in this life to maintain your life in this life. Suli's pupils shrank slightly, and she showed an intention. She stroked her wrist with her palm and suddenly sneered, I don't believe it. If someone can borrow the previous life and the next life, doesn't it mean that he can live forever regardless of his lifespan? If someone has tried this method, how can there be no records in the vast martial arts circle or even the spiritual circle? Senior Sister Apprentice, you can't find it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Mei Ruhan looked at Suli for a few seconds, and then turned her eyes and said, the world is so big. Maybe someone is using this method to prolong his life now, and the method I said is not perfect. Suli narrowed her eyes and said in a flat voice, what's the defect? She didn't believe the consciousness that occupied Mei Ruhan's body, but she didn't completely believe it. She just wanted to get information from it, but it seemed that this person didn't mean to cover up the defect. This method is against the harmony of nature, but if you take the initiative to break the past and the future, it will not lead to the wrath of nature. But, there will be a small loss. Mei Ruhan explained very carefully, as if she was sincerely dispelling Suli's doubts, after all, the foundation is the foundation. It is impossible to inherit all of the 2 lives. For example, if an old man who is about to die wants to live for 1 year, he needs to pay 2 years in both the previous life and the present life, which is 4 years. 4 times the consumption. Suli's heart sank slightly, and the idea of calculation flashed through her mind. She was at the peak of the innate realm in her previous life and had a lifespan of 200 years. If she could also live for 200 years in her future life, these 2 lives could only extend her lifespan by 100 years. This was more than a small loss. Of course, Suli knew that her idea excluded many factors and only calculated the foundation by lifespan. The real algorithm might be thousands of times more complicated. However, even so, if she could live for a few more decades, it would be enough for her to accomplish all her goals. Senior Marshall sister, are you thinking that even if you add up your previous and current lives, living for 100 years is enough? Mei Ruhan said in a slightly teasing tone with a bit of pity, then you are wrong. What you said is based on a premise. Suli frowned slightly, what precondition? You can't practice or use Xiangong. Suli frowned more tightly. It was impossible for her to do that. If she wanted to continue to run the Linli building, she must maintain the identity of Mr. Li. Senior Marshall sister, the foundation of 2 lives plundered is turned into vitality, but it is also energy. Mei Ruhan raised a piece of thin paper and tore it piece by piece. If the foundation is compared to this piece of paper, every time you practice, you will swallow a part of the foundation. Every time you fight, you will also swallow the foundation. When the foundation is exhausted, you will really face death. Clatter, the thin paper was torn into pieces and fell to the ground. Suli stared at the debris on the ground blankly. After a long silence, she slowly closed her eyes and whispered, I am tired. You can go out. Mei Ruhan changed her face slightly, but returned to normal in an instant. She stood up and said, then I will leave first. Occupying this body is also harmful to me. I will not appear again in the future. If you want to say something to me, you can ask this girl to pass the message. With that, she left the room without hesitation, closing the door behind her. Sensing the departure of Mei Ruhan, Suli suddenly opened her eyes, and a trace of sharpness flashed in her eyes. She knew clearly about the previous life. There was only endless misery. The foundation of the previous life was extremely high. It was all a lie. What he said after that was 9 lies and 1 truth. Although he didn't reveal a strong desire, he was trying to entice her to break the red bracelet on her wrist from beginning to end. Mei Ruhan had been living well in the Qinghe province. How could she not listen to Suli and come to Yunjing City so soon? This consciousness must be in the way. Suli suspected that this consciousness was coming for her. Even if she was not seriously injured this time, the consciousness might create opportunities for her to face a desperate situation and choose to break the bracelet. Thinking of this, Suli showed a bitter face and sighed helplessly. No matter whether this person's purpose was good or evil, she was very clear that she was absolutely unwilling to die now. In such a desperate situation, the bracelet must be broken. This was an overt plot. There was only one way in front of her. In the next few days, Suli had many strange dreams. The people in the dreams flew in the sky and hid in the ground. They were omnipotent like immortals in the sky. But these immortals were not as pure as the gossip in Jianghu. Instead, they became more greedy, cruel, and unscrupulous. In front of these immortals, the vicious behavior in the previous life seemed to be child's play. In the blink of an eye, 6 days passed. Fang Yuan returned to the Linli building and sat on Suli's bed without saying a word. He completely lost his smile. How could he find a way to save Suli in just 6 days? Later, Chu Qingning, Fang Mu and others came back one after another. They were all disappointed and speechless. They all came back to see Suli for the last time. However, after 1 day, Suli still lived well, and her face actually became a little ruddy. Is it the last radiance of the setting sun? Chu Qingning was full of sadness and didn't think much. Fong Yuan completely became a block of wood and stood motionless beside Su Li's bed. He and Yin Shuadong were responsible for preparing for Su Li's funeral. 3 days later, all the funeral arrangements had been made. But Chu Qingning was surprised to find that Su Li's pneuma did not weaken, but became stronger day by day. Her face also returned to normal. Compared with the pale and transparent face at the beginning, she was totally different. On the 4th day, Su Li sat up from the bed. She lifted the quilt and got out of bed. All the injuries on her body disappeared. Feeling the internal injuries in her body that healed quickly, Su Li shook her head and waved her hand, "Burn all the coffins and shrouds." Fong Yuan, who stood by the bed, was shocked. His eyes, which were originally full of doubt, completely turned into enthusiasm. Chu Qingning was stunned and then said with ecstasy, "Su Li, you won't die." Su Li touched her wrist and felt the huge and warm foundation of 2 lives. There was a hidden gloominess in her eyes, but she said gently, "For the time being, I won't die." "Great!" Chu Qingning was so excited that he almost jumped up. He quickly turned around and left. "I am going to burn those unlucky things and tell Shuadong the good news by the way." "Okay." Su Li smiled and nodded gently. Only Fong Yuan frowned. "For the time being, how long was it?" "Good news. Good news." Su Li came back to life. After Chu Qingning transmitted the sound several times, all the people who had known that Su Li was going to die received the news. They were no longer lifeless and were overjoyed. The ordinary disciples of the Linli building were confused and wondered why the lords were so excited today, as if they had taken medicine. "Great, that sister didn't lie." Mei Ruhan was also overjoyed. Her hostility to the other consciousness was reduced a lot. She even called her sister. At this moment, the figure of consciousness hidden in the depths of Mei Ruhan's mind sensed Mei Ruhan's joy and immediately burst into ecstasy. "Senior Sister Apprentice. Senior Sister Apprentice, you really broke the bracelet. Ha 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 ha. God helps me." The misty eyes of the misty figure shone. At this moment, Senior Sister Apprentice should be dead and can never be reincarnated. Ha 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 ha. Just for Lingley, who is not a human being, Senior Sister Apprentice, you are so sad, ha 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 ha. You suppressed me from the beginning. Everything is yours. Now everything is settled. I want the Master and the whole sect to know that only I am the eldest disciple with the strongest fate. Ha 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 ha. The crazy laughter echoed in the depths of Mei Ruhan's awareness sea, but no one heard it. After dinner in the evening, Su Li left the Linli building. Her injuries and cultivation had been completely recovered. Naturally, she had to go back to the affiliated school of the National Academy to deal with the trouble of disappearing for more than 10 days. If it were in the past, she would definitely choose to leave by physical movement. But now, she chose to walk. She couldn't waste the foundation of her 2 lives on a meaningless journey. The Linli building was neither far nor close to the affiliated school of the National Academy. She walked for 4 hours to get there. Unexpectedly, as soon as she appeared at the door, she was greeted by Butler Wu, who was full of joy. "Miss, you finally come back. It's so late. You walk alone at night. Aren't you afraid of danger? Next time, even if you know that the medicinal materials are precious, you must bring a helper." Wu Bin kept talking, but Su Li didn't show any boredom. Instead, she nodded with a smile. "It won't happen next time. I will take Yuni there." "That's good. By the way, Master has been waiting here for many days. Go in quickly. Father is here." Su Li's eyes flashed a touch of complexity. She paused for a moment but returned to normal in an instant. Then she walked into the room. Lee, you finally come back. I was so worried. Let me have a look. Dongfang Rui held Su Li anxiously and looked her left and right. When he found no trace of injury, he was relieved. After exhorting for a while, he fell asleep tiredly. He hadn't closed his eyes for several days. After the room was quiet, Yunyi came out from the darkness in shock. He stammered and asked, "Miss Yu?" Su Li waved her hand and said, "Something happened. Anyway, I am fine for the time being." "Miss, you are blessed by God." "That's great. I am going to tell the brothers to cancel the original plan." Yuni left quickly. Su Li looked at his back and gently stroked her left wrist. The foundation was as boundless as the ocean, which always reminded her how much time was left. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.